Okay, we are live. Alexander, how are you in London today?
Absolutely fantastically well. All is well for us. We've got children. We've got builders all over our house doing all kinds of important and necessary things. But it's actually a joy to come on our programs because, of course, that's, if you like, my holiday from all those sort of things. But seriously, I mean, we're extremely well and we're having an interesting time. And, of course, politics in Britain have never been more interesting in the sense that we have a massive power struggle going on in the Conservative government. And it's quite interesting to see how it's playing out. And we see how Boris Johnson basically turned the tables on the plotters within the Conservative Party. They're now becoming very, very nervous because, of course, there's no benefits to losing in these battles. It can be pretty awful for anybody who loses. So now they're trying to come up with some new plan, which is about how Johnson supposedly blackmailed Conservative MPs. Now, that isn't going to impress anybody in Britain because everybody knows in Britain that Conservative whips, as they're called, party managers, they're actually called whips. They actually routinely blackmail MPs. There have been British TV dramas about this. I mean, I remember a big one that happened some years ago about how the Conservatives were, how the Conservative whips office works. So this isn't going to impress anybody in Britain, and I don't think it's going to have any real effect. For the moment, I think Johnson has seen off the plotters. But anyway, all exciting stuff in Britain, all, of course, overshadowed by the big global news story. But we mustn't underestimate this. We've already seen how the power struggle has resulted in a massive swerve in policy on the pandemic.
Yes. Global shot heard around the world delivered by Boris Johnson. Is Boris going to defund the BBC?
Well, this is the other thing. I've had lots of questions about this. That was also a move during the power struggle. It's not impossible. I mean, there's a lot of hostility to the BBC now across Britain, and the BBC made the fatal mistake of antagonizing its core supporters. I mean, working class voters in the north of England have generally been supportive of the BBC, but they took it very badly when it was openly opposed to Brexit. And of course, left-wing voters didn't like the way they saw the BBC supporting the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn. So in combination, it's lost a vast swathe of support in Britain. I'm going to be fair, and I'm going to say that some of the TV dramas it does are still pretty good. I mean, it's still good at that sort of thing. Not as good, in my opinion, as it was, not remotely, but still it produces some quality stuff of that kind. But news and current affairs have been a disaster, and they've alienated a lot of people. They've alienated me. I mean, once upon a time, I was a stalwart supporter of the BBC, not because I ever had any illusions that it was completely objective, but because overall I still thought it was better than most other mainstream news channels that you got. But that was, talking about the world of 20, 30 years ago. The BBC today, the media, the way it projects news is so bad. I mean, I don't follow it anymore.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. So let's get rolling, Alexander, because we've got a busy topic to cover, an interesting topic to cover, busy news week. And first, let's say hello to everybody at Locals. Hello to our Locals chat. Chippewa Falls, minus 26 degrees Celsius. Jeez.
Wow. Crumbs.
Greetings from Cambria. That is cold. Minus 26. Cold. Hello to everyone in the YouTube chat as well. Hello to everyone in South Africa, Cape Town, and Serbia, and Australia, and Indiana. I saw someone from Indiana, the great state of Indiana, and Canada, and of course the UK, Alexander, and the great state of Virginia, my former home of Virginia.
Where there's been an important
Switzerland,
election. Yes. Where there's been an important election. In fact, elections in the US are pointing very clearly to a decisive outcome in the midterms. And we must never underestimate the importance of that. Yeah. And a lot of the politics, including the foreign politics that we're now looking at, I am convinced are connected to this.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. And Ireland is in the house, and Germany is with us. And we've got our great moderators as well. Let's give a shout out to them, and then we will get started. Thank you, Raphael, for that $1.99 super sticker. Thank you, Raphael, for that. And our moderators include the great Zarael. I see Zarael here with us. And Reckless Abandon is with us as well. And I think I saw Alan Watson somewhere in the chat as well, who's with us and helping us moderate. And I'm looking to see if there's any of the other moderators here, Alexander, to give a shout out to them. I think I've covered the moderators as well. So thank you to our moderators for everything that you do and for the help that you provide on the live stream. Alexander, let's just let's get right into it with the Biden press conference. And for a channel like ours, of course, we're going to want to talk about and cover the hysteria in and around Ukraine. And Tucker Carlson last night covered it. He made an interesting point that God, the U.S. focuses on Ukraine a lot. I mean, going back from 2014 with the Obama EU coup, which no one really seems to cover. Everyone covers the history of the recent history of Ukraine from the timestamp of Russia and Crimea. Everyone kind of seems to forget about McCain at the Maidan and Nuland passing out cookies and Obama and Biden instigating a coup there. No one ever talks about that. No one even goes back to the Orange Revolution either. All of that is just kind of forgotten about. Everyone just kind of covers the Russia's annexation of Crimea, which I like to say was more of an accession of Crimea into Russia rather than an annexation. But you may want to cover that as well. Anyway, Tucker made the point that for such a small country compared to the United States, Ukraine is on the minds of a lot of people in DC. You have the coup in 2014, you have Russiagate, you have Ukraine Gate, you have the Bidens, you have Burisma, and now you have more Ukraine. This time, Russia invaded Ukraine. So Biden gave the press conference. He said a lot of different things about a lot of various topics. Didn't mention the southern border of the United States at all. But anyway, he talked about Ukraine's border. And people focused on Ukraine a lot. I would say they focused more so on Ukraine than actually a lot of the domestic issues. At least the mainstream media did. And now we have this hysteria, which is the imminent Russia invasion. The first thing I would like you to clarify, though, is that for everyone that's watching us, a lot of people that have watched us for a while as we cover this story, I think they understand our coverage of Ukraine, our position with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. But on this channel, we are saying that Russia is not about to invade Ukraine. We've been very clear on that. Russia has been very clear on that. Russia isn't even talking to the United States about Ukraine per se. They're talking about NATO and security guarantees. The U.S. is talking about Ukraine. Russia's talking about NATO and security guarantees. But we've also been very clear on this channel, on your channel as well, that if red lines are crossed, then Russia will act. So if you can clarify exactly our position there, and if I could just throw one small caveat, there is the threat of a false flag. Absolutely. Not on Russia's part, but I believe on the West's part and on Ukraine's part, there could be a false flag. But I want to just throw a small little caveat that even if there is a false flag in East Ukraine, I am unsure if Russia will react to a false flag. It'll depend on what exactly happens. And what I use as a reference point, is when Turkey shot down the airplane. I was in Russia at the time when that happened, and I would say an overwhelming percentage of the population, 99%, wanted Russia to take military action against Turkey. I mean, people were fired up, and they were like, "We got to take action." Even then, the Russian government and Putin they stepped back and they took a different type of asymmetric approach towards the shooting down of that plane. So even a false flag is not 100% guarantee that something might happen. Russia is not going to just use its feelings to just jump into something. So just clarify the overall situation and our coverage and position of what's happening with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Absolutely. But before I do that, can I just explain one point which comes directly to the point that Tucker Carlson made? The real obsession is the fixation that you have in Washington amongst all these people that we're talking about, the hysteria we see. It's not really about Ukraine at all. It is about Russia. This is the country that they are fixated about. That's why we have Russiagate. That's why we had Ukrainegate, which is really, again, about Russia. Ultimately, that's why there was all this extraordinary reaction, hysteria when Donald Trump talked about doing a deal with the Russians. And it's not about Ukraine at all. It is about Russia. Now, this is where we come back to Russian policy. The Russians announced back in the summer that they had red lines. Putin made it very clear Russia has red lines about the situation on its western border, and it will act forcefully to defend its red lines. So if there is an all-out attack by the Ukrainian military on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Russia will act. They've said so. I mean, there's no dispute or doubt about this. They've made that absolutely clear. Of course, if there's an attack on Crimea, which, by the way, is not impossible, they will react to that also. They have quietly, and this isn't, I think, widely understood, already closed the Sea of Azov, which is the sea around Mariupol. They've already closed it off essentially to Ukrainian ships. I'm talking about not real ships, but, shallow draft military vessels. So the Russians will respond, and they will respond decisively to defend their red lines. What the Russians are not going to do is take preemptive action. They're not going to say, well, we're going to anticipate some kind of Ukrainian offensive and therefore launch a preemptive strike. And the other thing they're not going to do is they're not going to say to themselves, at least the present government in Moscow is not going to say to itself, well, look, this is our good opportunity. The West is weak. The West is confused. This is our moment to sort out the Ukrainian problem. Let us launch our own offensive, go into Ukraine and sort it out. That isn't the way the Russians work. Now, there's an element of very strong calculation here, because the Russians, from their point of view, it's important to understand, they don't just want the eastern Ukraine. They want a whole of Ukraine once more friendly to themselves. That is, I think, the ultimate overall Russian objective. That was what Putin's famous article, which has been so misrepresented, was ultimately all about. So they don't want to go marching in, seize eastern Ukraine, leave all of western Ukraine, to look after itself. That's not their intention. But if there is an attack, if there is some even more extreme action, if there's an attack on the Donbass, if there's moves to bring Ukraine into NATO, if there's a deployment of offensive weapons to Ukraine. By offensive weapons, I don't mean light anti-tank weapons, Javelin missiles, Stinger missiles, or these 5 MiL-17 transport helicopters that are going to be deployed there, because none of that makes any real difference to the overall military picture. I'm talking about missiles. I'm talking about long-range artillery. I'm talking about tanks. I'm talking about jet fighters. I'm talking about those sort of things. If that happens, again, the Russians will react. And when we talk about reaction, it's again important to say that Russia has a very, very wide range of tools and options it can use in this area. Remember, it always has as Barack Obama admitted, escalatory dominance. So if there is some kind of, shall we say, false flag attack on the Donbass conflict line, which leads to a fight, but doesn't actually change anything significantly, well, the Russians could react to that, but they might not react by launching a whole outright invasion. They might take other steps. They might start taking covert steps that we're not even aware of. They might, for example, orchestrate runs on Ukrainian banks, which looking increasingly shaky. They might do any number of things. They might start taking action to interfere, for example, with Ukrainian exports from Odessa. It's one possibility. They can do lots of things. There's a whole series of steps that the Russians could take, all the way up to, obviously, a counteroffensive. But we mustn't assume that they will rush to do that. Now, again, I'm going to say something else. If Ukraine were to launch an all-out offensive on the Donbass, like they did in 2014, the first step I expect that the Russians would take in that event would be diplomatic. If you go back to the situation in 2008, when Georgia launched its attack on South Ossetia, the very first step the Russians took was to contact the UN, arrange for an urgent session of the Security Council, and present at the Security Council a draft resolution requiring, under Article 7, for the militaries to return to their previous contact lines. And what happened in 2008, and what would happen again, by the way, is that they would run into a wall of opposition from the Western powers if that resolution isn't implemented within a few days. Not a few days, sorry, I should correct that. Within a few hours, then the Russians will act. That's what they did in 2008. They took the diplomatic route first. They ticked that particular box. They then said, we're protecting our citizens. Lots of our people in South Ossetia have passports. Lots of our passports. Lots of people in the Donbass have our passports too. They reacted in 2008 in that way, and they would do the same again in Ukraine if there was that kind of attack on the Donbass. And I suspect that the consequences would be the same. When there was the 2008 Georgia war, the Russians launched a counteroffensive. It was absolutely overwhelming and devastating. It obliterated the Georgian army within 3 days. One of the absurdities about all narratives of that war is that you constantly hear about how the Russian military performed poorly in it. It won the war in 3 days. I mean, that's the thing people need to understand. I mean, that was not a muddled operation. That was an incredibly successful one. And after they did that, they didn't march on Tbilisi. They didn't march on the capital, but they massively expanded the territories that South Ossetia and Abkhazia had, and they brought into South Ossetia and Abkhazia all the territories of the former oblasts, the former regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia that had existed in the Soviet Union. And that included a lot of territory that had previously been occupied by Georgia. And it would be exactly the same, in my opinion, in this instance. Moreover, I think it is highly likely that in the event of such a war, given what the Russians say about the anti-Russian policies of the Ukrainian government, they would go further still. They would take Kharkiv. They would drive all the way to Odessa. I think it's highly likely that they would do that. And of course, not only would that bring Russian-speaking areas under Russian control, but it would cut Ukraine off from the sea. And that would give the Russians massive leverage over Ukraine. In fact, it's difficult to see how a Ukraine that would be left after that kind of war would be viable. So that's how the Russians would act. They wouldn't rush in. They're not, I think, planning a preemptive strike or an offensive. No reason why they would do that. They would react if their red lines are crossed, and they would calibrate their response.
Right.
They would do enough to enforce their red lines. They wouldn't necessarily go beyond that, because that's how Russia conducts itself. And of course, the point to understand is with every single game, they improve their position. And their ultimate objective, as I said, is to bring this whole territory back onto, into friendship and dialogue with themselves, what the West calls a sphere of influence. But also, I think, to keep the West off balance, which is what, of course, they also managed at the time of the Georgia War.
Yeah. Blinken is, actually, I think they finished Blinken and Lavrov meeting.
He's got a press conference at the moment.
Yeah. Very quick meeting, from what I understand, but we haven't heard any statements yet.
No.
But what is the fact that it was, I believe, just like an hour and change, an hour and a half? What does that tell you, do you think?
Well, it tells us that nothing substantive was agreed. I mean, that seems to me obvious. Again, we need to come back to the point that you made at the start of the program. The Western media, Western governments have made this issue entirely about Ukraine. They're talking about these discussions between Lavrov and Blinken as being about Ukraine. The Russians don't report it in that way at all. They say it is about their request for legally binding security guarantees. Now, the United States and NATO were supposed to come up with a response, a written, detailed response to the Russian draft treaties by the end of this week. And they haven't done so. And the Russians are now starting to grumble and complain about this. And I suspect what will have happened at this meeting, now, of course, we don't have the full details, but I suspect what will have happened is that Blinken will come along, make his usual play about the Russians must pull back their forces from Russia. I mean, that's essentially what it amounts to. Pull back your forces from Russia. Russian troops aren't allowed in Russia. At least we have to control which parts of Russia your troops are in, which, of course, the Russians, Lavrov, is going to completely reject. Blinken is going to try to bring the whole discussion back to Ukraine. And Lavrov is going to say, well, where are your written responses? Where are these written responses which we were promised? Are we going to get them or not? And I think that Blinken will again say that they will provide these written responses sometime next week. But as the Russians have already said, their patience on this is not limitless. And if they don't get those written responses within a relatively short space of time, they will simply act as if the United States is incapable of providing a written response. And then they will start to take steps that will adjust to the fact that the Western powers have in effect refused their request for legally binding security guarantees. And again, the Russians have a variety of responses that they can take. And already we're starting to see, and this is again where Western powers don't, I think Western media doesn't somehow grasp that this is Russia operates a multi-vector type of strategies. We've had Ebrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, in Moscow. There's talk about Russia supplying Sukhoi 35 fighter jets and S-400 missile systems to Iran. More importantly, or perhaps more obviously, there are now going to be joint naval exercises, Iran, China, and Russia. And Russian ships have already arrived off the Iranian coast to start off those exercises. And so, we see moves there. We start to see more moves with China. Putin and Xi Jinping are going to have an important summit meeting, the first big summit meeting that Xi Jinping has had with a world leader one-to-one meeting. It's going to happen on the 4th of February. We're going to see all kinds of things starting to happen. And we're going to see new Russian weapon systems being deployed. By the way, it's increasingly looking as if this Poseidon submarine drone that I harp on about, and people are getting more irritated with me because I seem to, constantly talk about it, even though I think it is actually a very serious weapon. But it's increasingly looking as if it is designed to go on autonomous patrol. So you're going to have these things moving around the Pacific, waiting for an instruction from Moscow, at which point they will start to head towards the west coast of the United States. And presumably before long, we'll see them in the Atlantic too. And that's probably not going to happen soon. I mean, this is still a weapon system in its development stage, but probably not very far from being developed. And we've had more demonstrations recently of the Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missile system. And we're going to have more and more of these weapon systems starting to appear on the horizon. And it's important to say they will be targeted on the continental United States, putting the United States in an increasingly difficult military position. So, all of that's going on. And there'll also be discussions, of course, about further joining up the Chinese, Russian economies, bringing Iran into the system, doing all those kind of things. So they will slowly but steadily dial up the temperature. In that speech, it's a very important speech, which people barely acknowledge, but that very important speech that Putin made about 2 months ago at the Russian Foreign Ministry, Collegium, he said that until the United States agrees to the Russian demands for legally binding security guarantees, Russia's strategy is to pursue a strategy of tension. In other words, to increase the pressure on the United States until eventually the United States comes to the table. And I predict that in time it will.
Yeah, the Biden White House can't deal with this. They're not equipped to deal at the level that Russia is at this moment in time. You paint a very interesting, compelling picture. I like the word that you use, calibrate, that Russia will calibrate their response. I believe, once again, going back to Turkey, their calibration there was, we're not going to take any military action. What we will do is we'll sink their tourist economy. Exactly. And that's exactly what they did. And sure enough, Erdogan came back to Russia, begging for Russia to once again open up the tourism business to Turkey. So it was a very interesting response they took in Turkey. You mentioned their response to what happened in Georgia as well. While the U.S., it's interesting to listen to you, because while the U.S. is dealing with January 6th, constantly January 6th, 24/7, or they're dealing with getting rid of the filibuster, and everyone is the R word or the white S word. You see what Russia and much of the international community is doing, and they're out making deals, and they're setting up institutions and a new world order and alliances. Speak to what Macron has said, because it's very interesting. Even Macron seems to understand that we need to start moving forward. We need to start doing things with Russia, with China, with the world, and to stop all this, all the nonsense of the past, year and a half with Biden. Orban is going to be meeting with Putin soon. On the 4th of February, the Olympics start. And Russia will be meeting with China, Xi and Putin, and they are going to, I think they're going to shock the world. I mean, I think the world's going to remain stunned. But, during the Olympics, you also have to be very careful, because, if you take a look back at the Olympics, that's usually when false flags and certain things happen. So I'm sure that Russia and China are aware of that as well. So, just speak to that. I mean, there is a part of the world, a significant part of the world, that seems to be done with Biden. And they seem to be done with all this stupidity that that is coming out of the Democrats and out of the Biden White House. They just want to move on from it.
Exactly. So I think also, and it's important to say that in Western Europe, governments there, governments in Germany, governments in France, have ridden along with this ridden on this tiger of anti-Russian policies that have been pouring out of Washington, Brussels, and London, because up to now they haven't had to pay any particular cost. But we've now reached the point where it's beginning to loom on the horizon that if this thing deteriorates, then costs are going to start rising, and they're going to start rising drastically. Now, we hear an awful lot about energy situation. There's a massive article, again in the Financial Times, about how on gas, on energy, if there was a real switch off of Russian gas supplies, there would be an absolutely awful crisis in Europe. I mean, beyond imagination how terrible it would be. But it isn't just, of course, energy. I mean, there's a whole range of interconnections that would be a problem. And of course, even if Europe somehow adjusted to the loss of Russian energy after, well, presumably a couple of years of crisis, it would still leave the Europeans at a major disadvantage. It would mean that Europe would have to accept energy prices at a much higher price than would be the case if they were still receiving Russian pipeline gas as makes sense to them. It would also massively complicate all kinds of things. Just to give one small example, if there's a sanctions war, there's always the risk, in fact, there's a high probability, for example, that the Russians would then close their airspace to European carriers, air carriers, at which point they wouldn't be able to fly across Russia to the Far East, to places like Japan, Singapore, China. They'd have to take this massive circuitous routes of, to try and avoid Russia. That would add hours to the journey, large prices, large costs, and of course, that would mean that they would be at a structural disadvantage against Far Eastern carriers, which would, of course, be able to still continue to fly across Russia. So, even the airline industry, and remember, Asia is now the booming market. Even the airline industry must be extremely worried about all of this. So that's making some of the more intelligent, or shall we say the less unintelligent, because none of these people is particularly overburdened with brain, but the less unintelligent European leaders start to become worried and start to become nervous. And a couple of weeks ago, we saw Mario Draghi, who is, if nothing else, I mean, he's certainly not a fool. He came along and he said Europe cannot survive without Russian energy supplies, and that's the reality. He said that, as this crisis was building up. And now Macron comes along to the European Parliament, and it's one of those typical Macron speeches in that there's a lot of mood music and atmosphere and many generalities. There's no details, but what there is an acknowledgement that there has to be a new security architecture in Europe, and one which involves Russia. Now, that is anathema to the neocon tendency. That is exactly the opposite of what they want. So the very fact that Macron can't come up with a proposal shows, in my opinion, what a limited politician he is. But the fact that he accepts, that he acknowledges that a new security architecture is needed, nonetheless, from a Russian point of view, is a breakthrough. And that is why, by the way, the media, Western governments, the Brussels bureaucracies are so angry with him at the moment.
Yeah. The fact that he just comes out and says it, you got to give credit there. At least he says it.
Absolutely.
And no one else does. Even though I think Germany understands it.
Yes.
But they just don't say it. Macron actually comes out and admits it.
Well, the Germans have got themselves into a complete mess. And I'll tell you straight away that this is not surprising to me because, again, we talk about Germany an awful lot on these programs. We've talked about Merkel an awful lot of these programs. One of the things you find when you go to Germany, and I know people from Germany watching these programs, and I'd be interested to see how they respond to this. But German politics is very regional. And the result, I'm afraid, is that it translates in terms of federal policy, the policy of Germany as a state, into a very, very, I think sometimes rather provincial approach to foreign policy. And it means that you don't have powerful political leaders like Willy Brandt, for example, whose origins go back, who started in politics during the 1930s and 1940s, who are able to have this sort of global vision about what Germany's place is. And of course, they're also way down with these fears from, what happened in the 40s. There's also this very powerful Atlanticist bloc in Germany itself. And the result is that Germany never really is able to come up with a clear policy. Still very difficult to imagine a German leader, a German chancellor, talking in the way that Macron has done. So we get instead Annalena Baerbock going to Moscow. She takes a much more conciliatory line than people had expected. There were some very bitter articles about her, by the way, in the British media from the sort of neocon types saying, that she's really disappointed them and that they'd expected more from her. Anyway, she didn't take this very harsh Atlanticist line in Moscow. There's talk that Scholz is looking to meet with Putin. But what will happen, I predict, is that there'll be these meetings, there'll be these discussions, but there won't be any real conceptual breakthrough on the part of the Germans, because even though they can sense that this is turning now incredibly bad for them, they haven't got either the imagination, the ability, if you like, to think out of the box. They don't have that ability to do that because, of course, their politics is not structured in that way. It will take a major shock for Germany to break out of this and to start thinking differently. If you go back to the 60s, the big shock that galvanized German politics and which led to the emergence of Willy Brandt and his Ostpolitik in the late 60s was the building of the Berlin Wall. I mean, that was the shock that galvanized Germany. It would take, I think, some similar kind of shock today to do the same.
Yeah. Do you think that Russia is worried about the Olympics and a false flag coming during the Olympics, or China as well, for that matter? Do you think they're actually very concerned that something is going to take place during the Olympics? And Davwil in Locals asks, if Russia catches the CIA attempting a color revolution, how far do you think Russia will go? I mean, do you think they're prepared for something to happen?
Oh, absolutely.
And when it does happen, especially now. But, I mean, we're only, 2 weeks away from the start of the game. Well, so if something's going to happen, I mean, it's already been cooked up and it's going to take place. I mean, are they ready? Are they expecting it? Should we expect it?
They are absolutely ready, and we know they are because they've said so. I mean, the rather formidable spokesperson at the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, has actually come out with a statement about it, saying that the US and the Western powers are scheming against the Olympics in Beijing. I mean, she said that straightforwardly, and she's done it in a way which clearly implies that the Russians are, having been burnt very badly when they staged their own Olympics in Sochi back in 2014, only to have the Maidan events play out whilst those were going on. The Russians this time are determined not to be caught in that same way again, and they'll be advising the Chinese, and they're fully prepared for any dramas in advance of the Olympics this time. The Chinese are being very quiet because obviously they don't want to rock the boat with the Olympics. They want to see the Olympics happen. And as is so often the case nowadays, the Chinese, I think, are happy to leave it to the Russians to deal with any problem of that kind. The one thing that would, of course, change the picture for China is if there was some sort of move in Taiwan. But unless it's something dramatic like that, the Chinese will be very quiet. If for the Russians there's some crisis in Ukraine or some other place, well, they will react, and they've made it already known that they're well aware of the way in which the US, the Western powers, have used Olympics as distractions in the past.
Right. Okay. Let's keep on going. We have a lot to cover, Alexander. How bad is this for the Ukrainians, for the people of Ukraine? All of this, this drama, all of this, this hysteria coming out of the Western mainstream media. A lot of this is Zelensky's doing, but Zelensky has a lot of problems as well. How bad is it for Ukraine? That's the first thing I would like you to address. And also, many people don't talk about as Ukraine continues to dissolve and continues to disintegrate, with or without a conflict with Russia, because I really believe the future of Ukraine is sorting out the dispute that they have with the East. And that is what the Minsk agreements clearly state, that this is an internal conflict. Ukraine needs to engage with the East. But as they do not do that, the country continues to falter. How bad is it for the countries in and around Ukraine, for example, Poland? How many more migrants can Poland take from Ukraine? A conflict would overwhelm Poland and other countries that border Ukraine. They don't want anything happening either. It's a disaster for the other countries that border Ukraine as well. You've talked about how Ukraine has already gone through a major depopulation of sorts. I mean, I believe the count was at one point 43 million.
44 million.
44 million now.
It was 50 million when the USSR broke up. But of course, that includes places like Crimea. But then
and now the count is
44. It was 44 million.
I've heard 38 now, 36.
We don't know because, of course, they don't do a census. But the suspicion is that it's in the mid-30s. Some people put it even lower than that. And one of the things that this crisis has exposed, by the way, is that there's a shortage of young men and, to send into the front lines. I suspect many of them, by the way, the moment they hear stories about the fact that they might be conscripted, are going to take the first flight or bus to the European Union to get out of this, because they don't want to be sent into a meat grinder in the Donbass. But the Ukrainian military has now been trying to conscript women. And this has gone down incredibly badly, apparently. There's been a lot of opposition to this. Now, it's important to say that there is the real country with its many problems, and then there is the fictional country that you read about in the media. And whenever things in the Western media and whenever things in the real country happen, which don't correspond to the fictional narrative, they just don't get reported in the media. And of course, there was that big torchlight parade by followers of Bandera, a couple of days ago. That wasn't reported in the Western media. But what's even more remarkable is Zelensky's recent address to the Ukrainian people. Now, I haven't read a single commentary about this or report about it anywhere in the Western media. But what he's saying, what Zelensky said in that address to the people, is that there's a lot of hysteria, there's a lot of panic about the situation. It's causing people to start taking money out of the banks, not perhaps fully a run yet on the banks, but starting to sort of edge towards that. They're the first signs of panic buying, and he's trying to reassure the Ukrainian people that, there is no real cause for concern because things aren't as bad as they're being told. And, that you would have thought would be a big news story, that, you know, the Ukrainian population is beginning to become stressed and nervous amidst all this talk. And of course, I haven't seen a single report about it anywhere in any Western media outlet. Very remarkable. What you get instead are people who go to the front line, you know, people like Luke Harding. I noticed he was on the front line. He meets invariably he's presented with some, you know, Ukrainian NCO who's obviously been handpicked to do that by the defense ministry. He tells people like Luke Harding, you know, of course, we will fight to the last drop of our blood. But it becomes obvious, even if you go past that interview, even Luke Harding can't conceal the very poor condition of the Ukrainian military on the front line, the fact that it's bogged down in trench warfare, that it doesn't really seem in any condition to launch any kind of real offensive, that if there was a war, it would very, very quickly over. So you have this story about, you know, heroic Ukraine, people ready to fight to the death. In reality, the true Ukraine is a Ukraine where there are the first glimmers and fears of panic, where there's anger because women are having to be conscripted, and where, of course, there is a festering political crisis because Zelensky has been worried that there's now going to be an attempt to remove him and that the oligarchs are ganging up on him. He had the leader of the pro-Russian party, Viktor Medvedchuk, arrested and subjected to treason charges. He tried to go after Poroshenko, his predecessor, who he says, incredibly, is in some kind of league with Medvedchuk, which seems bizarre, but that's what Zelensky says. The courts in Ukraine have refused to enforce the arrest warrant against Poroshenko, which suggests that his political position in Ukraine is slipping because, of course, court decisions in Ukraine always follow the political wind. And so you have a political crisis, you have a growing sense of panic, you have military problems, and all of this comes on top of an overall economic situation in Ukraine, which is very bad. Inflation, of course, is there, as it is everywhere else. But bear in mind, Ukraine has never recovered to anything close to the level that it had in 1991 when it split away from the Soviet Union. There's been massive deindustrialization in the eastern regions. And as I understand it, the economy is still significantly below the level it had in 2013 before the Maidan coup took place. So it's a bad situation altogether. So you have the fictional country that you hear about, you have the real country where things are very different. And it's entirely the victim of this power play. And the fact that important events like Zelensky's broadcast, the worries about the conscription of the women, the fact that there's the first hints of panic buying aren't being reported in the media in the West, tell you again the point that I made at the start of this program. This isn't a crisis about Ukraine. The fixation isn't with Ukraine. In fact, there's no real interest in Ukraine. The real interest always is Russia. It's about Russia. It's not about Ukraine at all.
Yeah, Ukraine is just being used. But the reason they're using Ukraine, some people say, is so that they can lay blame onto Russia and by extension China for an incoming crash that's going to hit the United States and Europe, possibly. Perhaps they want the crash to happen in Europe. That's why some sort of conflict in Ukraine would benefit some of these neocons and some of these crazies out there. Do you think that's possible? Do you think a lot of this demonization, once again, and heavy demonization of Putin and Russia, again, Russia's going to invade, Putin's a dictator, Russia is evil, they must be stopped. And now we're hearing a lot of the same stuff, being portrayed on China as well, the China and the human rights violations, and they shouldn't be holding the Olympic Games. And we're hearing a lot of this talk coincide with a lot of the narrative about Russia. do you think this is about creating the boogeyman that is going to be blamed for when some sort of crash does hit the Biden White House, and they would like that crash to carry over into Europe as well?
Yes, I mean, it's quite possible. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I mean, you're going back to Biden's press conference, everything, all is well. All is going exactly according to plan. I have actually exceeded my expectations, my objectives. I mean, very, 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 very surreal stuff. But, it's not impossible that the narrative, if there is an economic crisis, and it comes after, a crisis in Ukraine and all the rest, and sanctions and massive problems in Europe, feeding into massive problems in the United States. It's not us. We're good people. Everything was working all so well. It's all that horrible man, Mr. Putin. And let's never forget that Donald Trump, our major Republican opponent, is in some way connected to Putin. So, we can create this great narrative that it's the Russians, the Chinese, that they're undermining our great economy, and that this bad man, this bad orange man, is somehow in league with them. I think the fundamental problem with that is, I can see it, I can buy it. I mean, I think that, it's important always to say that what these people are ultimately is narrative constructors. They're not managers. They're not even politicians in the conventional sense. They are narrative constructors. And you can see that this kind of narrative could be spun. And of course, there will be some people who believe it. The problem is, I think more and more Americans, more and more Europeans are starting to see through it. And what they will say is, well, we got into this mess ultimately because you mishandled the situation with Ukraine so completely. So it's not going to actually play to their advantage. It's going to work against them, because people will say, well, whatever the cause of it was, whether it's your own reckless economic policies or the fact that you haven't managed Russia properly, nonetheless, it's still your fault because you're clearly failing. And that's, I think, more likely what is going to happen. But the problem with narrative constructors is that they fall in love with their own narrative, and it doesn't necessarily follow that they've thought the full implications of it through. So yes, I buy it. I'm prepared to accept that. I mean, I don't know for a fact that this is what the grand plan is, but I can see how it might work. How they could say, we need to rally around the president in this time of crisis. He's our JFK of today against, the terrifying Russians who are doing all of these things. The economic problems that we are facing, or, the price we must pay because we have to stand up to these terrible people. And besides, our crisis is entirely created by them, not by us. But as I said, I don't think the American people will buy it.
Yeah, well, I disagree with you just a little bit in the fact that they've kind of bought the Nord Stream stupidity, haven't they? Which is, it was Russia that wanted Nord Stream. It was Russia that forced Germany to build Nord Stream, and the U.S. doesn't stop it, and this is just terrible. Where we've documented quite specifically that Russia had no interest in Nord Stream 2. It was Germany that came along. But you do see that the American media, from big to small, they continue to parrot the fact that, Russia was the ones that wanted Nord Stream. Biden gave the green light to Nord Stream. He didn't cancel it. So you see what's going on there. And, they've constructed a whole narrative around Nord Stream 2.
Absolutely. A completely false
they really
narrative.
Have bought that. Yeah, they really have bought the Nord Stream 2.
And overwhelmingly people have bought it. I mean, independent media in the US has bought it. But the point is, it's a complicated topic.
Yeah.
It's not one also that directly impacts on Americans. I mean, most Americans, to be straightforward about it, they don't care much about Nord Stream 2. It's a pipeline between Germany and Russia. We're not really interested in it. So, I mean, it's very easy in that way for that reason to create this narrative that this is all a Russian project and that the Germans were somehow, drawn into this spider's web of Russian pipelines. Why the Germans would want to have that happen to them is another matter. But anyway, so it's easy to spin a narrative about something that doesn't affect people. But if you have a situation where stock markets are crashing, where inflation is rising, where there's fuel running out in the shops, where the shelves are empty, well, people start to see things differently, because, of course, at that point, then what you find is that people start to concentrate and focus, and they say to themselves, look, I'm not interested in the detail. I don't care ultimately about, what Mr. Putin, who we've heard so much about over these last couple of decades, what exactly he's up to. At the end of the day, you, the Democrats, are not handling this situation well, and we want someone else to step in and take over. And I think that's probably much more likely what's going to happen. Now, I mean, I don't want to run ahead of myself. I mean, I don't know whether there's going to be an economic crisis of that nature, but if we end up in that kind of scenario, then, as I said, narrative spinning can only take you so far if people are having to pay much higher prices for their domestic fuel.
Yeah, I don't know how they'll blame Russia if it does come to that, but they'll figure out some sort of narrative to blame Russia. That there's no doubt about it.
Of course they will.
Yeah. Let's see. Before we get to, we have a lot of questions to get to. Some questions on locals and the super chats, and we'll not knock those out. We'll knock those out. Do you want to, Alexander, maybe take 5 or 10 minutes to just explain a little bit of the history of Ukraine from 2013-14?
Yeah.
I mean, just to set the record straight, because once again, there is so much disinformation about what actually happened when Nuland touched down in Ukraine and passed out her cookies, and John McCain was at the Maidan and said, I think I'll quote him directly, Ukraine's future lies with Europe. I mean, that was John McCain on multiple occasions saying that. Yeah. Do you want to get into that a little bit and maybe even touch down on Crimea a bit as well?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
What happened in Crimea was not an invasion. Russian forces did not storm into Ukraine from the east and land on the shores of Crimea either. I mean, just 5-10 minutes to just clear it up, because once again, so much disinformation about what happened in Ukraine, which has brought us to where we are today. And interestingly enough, it's brought us to where Tucker Carlson, as he said on his show, seems that Ukraine is on every mind in DC over the past 5 years. It's Ukraine, which is ultimately about Russia. But still, all we hear about is Ukraine.
Absolutely. Now, the thing to understand is that pre-2013 Ukraine was 4 extremely distinct and extremely distinct regions. So there was Crimea, which didn't really feel that it ought to have been in Ukraine at all, because it overwhelmingly felt itself to be Russian. It was transferred when it was part of the Soviet Union. And remember, Soviet Union was a very centralized country, but Khrushchev transferred it from the Russian Federation to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, putting it under administrative supervision from Kiev instead of Moscow, which the Crimeans didn't like at all, but they weren't, of course, consulted about it. And so it didn't want to be part of Ukraine. It didn't want to secede from Russia. It had no interest in being part of the Ukraine. But up to that time, the Russians weren't trying to persuade it to leave. The Russians had a major naval base there, which they'd agreed at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse. The Ukrainians agreed that they would be allowed to keep. So they had a major naval base there, and they had much of their military there already in Crimea. Then there is eastern Ukraine, and that is about 40% in population terms of the country, which is Russian speaking. These are the territories that were conquered in the 18th century by Catherine the Great and her general and probable husband, Prince Potemkin. This vast block of territory includes places like Odessa, Mariupol, Kherson, All these are names, by the way, given to these towns by Catherine the Great.
Catherine the Great.
Exactly.
Odessa is the city of Catherine the Great.
Indeed, absolutely. Sevastopol is the city of Catherine the Great. Absolutely. And, they're all very much into classics. So Odessa is named after Odysseus, for example, the Greek hero. Kherson, again, after a city in the Byzantine Empire. Mariupol. All of these places have Greek-sounding names, but they're actually given to them by Catherine the Great and Potemkin. Overwhelmingly, this is a Russian-speaking area. The people who went there were Russians. They were Russian speakers. They came from all over the Tsar's empire, but these are overwhelmingly Russian-speaking areas, and this area also includes the key coal mining industrial region of the Donbass, places like Donetsk, Lugansk, those sort of places. And further north, you have the great industrial city of Kharkiv, which is again overwhelmingly Russian in terms of language, perspectives, those sort of views. And this region supported politicians in Ukraine who wanted to maintain good relations with Russia, and the entire industrial commercial contacts were with Russia. Then there's a large block of territory in the center of Ukraine, which is Ukrainian speaking. The capital, Kiev, is located in this central region. It's Ukrainian speaking, but it was part of the Tsar's empire. It's Orthodox up to 2013, up to that time of political crisis. It tended to be quite willing to have good relations with Russia. And then further to the west, smallest region of Ukraine is the former Habsburg territories of Galicia, which were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 and 1940 as a result of the events that followed from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They'd been part of the Habsburg Empire, that then been part of Poland. This area is predominantly Uniate or Catholic. It is Ukrainian speaking. It is deeply antagonistic to Russia. It wants to push Ukraine to the west. Now, the story of post-independent Ukraine is that repeatedly you have political leaders in Kiev who are elected on the votes of Eastern Ukrainians, people like the President Kuchma, President Yanukovych, who are then overthrown through street protests, which are driven by Western Ukrainians. And by the way, this has happened 3 times. There was 3 occasions. There was the Orange Revolution, when there was an event in 2007, which is very little noticed, but when the Ukrainian government and parliament were dissolved, because again, it was leading to pro-Russian parties dominating them. And of course, it again happened in 2013, 2014. And the reason this has happened is because Western governments, the European Union, the United States, have overwhelmingly supported these people in Western Ukraine who have been aligned also to some Ukrainian oligarchs who don't want to see Ukraine absorbed into a kind of Russian sphere because they're worried about their positions if this happens. And so there's been this tug of war. And always the Western Ukrainians won out because they had the support of the West, and the Russians weren't really engaged very strongly in Ukraine at that time because they were focused on their own problems. And that culminated in this crisis in 2013 over whether Ukraine would enter into an association agreement with the EU, which would have resulted in it severing its links with Russia. This created a political crisis in Ukraine, And it resulted in the democratically and constitutionally elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, being overthrown in 2014 in a coup and replaced by an Ukrainian nationalist, ultra-nationalist government with its roots in Western Ukraine. Now, what then happened is that the people who had supported Yanukovych, people who'd voted for him in Crimea, in the Donbass, his home region, in those sort of places, they were very alarmed by this coup. They started protests. In the case of Crimea, they said, enough's enough. We absolutely do not want to be part of a pro-Western Ukraine. We do not want to be annexed and brought into NATO. So Crimea broke away and joined with Russia. There was no Russian invasion of Crimea because the Russian troops were already there. That's a point, again, which is never properly articulated. But you saw an uprising also in the Donbass, which said, we reject this coup. We want our own, either our own independence or at the very least our own autonomy. And then what happened was, with the support of Western governments, specifically and primarily of the United States, this nationalist government, which seized power in Kiev in February 2014, instead of negotiating with the people of Eastern Ukraine some kind of autonomy, because that would have contradicted their objective of a centralized Ukrainian-dominated, monolingual Ukraine, they launched a war against Eastern Ukraine, in which Ukraine was comprehensively defeated. And that has left a festering crisis in Ukraine, which has never been resolved since then. That is the true story of Ukraine.
Yeah. They don't really like the diversity of Ukraine, do they?
No, of course not.
They want the diversity in the United States. They don't want the diversity in Ukraine.
They don't acknowledge it. I mean, they barely ever acknowledge its existence. You see, you get every so often some little glimmers of admissions that there are some Ukrainians who speak Russian. But politically, their feelings, the feelings of these people, never count for anything. They're never actually acknowledged as having an independent agency in any Western media discussion of this issue.
Yeah. And in that terrible Russian invasion of Crimea, a total of 0 people died.
Well, absolutely. Exactly. Well, you don't hear that either.
You don't hear that as well.
I did read, interestingly, a rather anguished admission in the New York Times that, lots of attempts to stir up resistance to the Russians in Crimea had come to nothing, but no actual explanation of why that was the case.
Yeah. They tried to instigate some terrible things in Crimea as well.
Indeed. And they tried to set the Tatar population of Crimea against the Russians, which didn't work out at all.
Yeah. They had a mini January 6th type of a moment in Crimea where the security state of Ukraine, and with the help, I'm sure, of some other interagency actors, they tried to create some sort of crisis and false flag at that town hall in Crimea.
That's right,
and it failed because the Russian security services, they caught on to it. They saw what was going on.
Absolutely. And I have to say this straight away. I mean, coming back to the point that we've made. I mean, this idea that there would be some great partisan guerrilla war against the Russians in eastern Ukraine is a nonsense. There is no factual basis at all. People who talk like that are not aware of the situation in eastern Ukraine. In central Ukraine, if the Russians were to re-annex all those territories or reoccupy all those territories that formerly were part of the Tsarist Empire, I think there might be some opposition, but I don't think it would manifest itself in armed resistance to any significant degree. And I'm going to say this: I don't think the Russians would want to occupy Western Ukraine. It is of no use to them. But even if they did, even there, I think this assumption that there would be some massive opposition to the Russians, that there would be tremendous, fighting, that young men would go out and go to camps in Poland or wherever. I mean, I think this isn't realistic. I think what would happen, and this comes back to your earlier point about what would happen to Europe. What would happen is you'd see a mass exodus of a lot of people. They wouldn't want to fight the Russians. They would decide to go to the West. After all, there's visa-free travel between Ukraine and the European Union now. You'd see a mass exodus of young people, professional people, all sorts of people. They would leave. And of course, you'd have another refugee crisis.
Yeah. That's
not something that the Russians are planning or want to see. And of course, if it happens, you can be absolutely sure that, we'll hear all kinds of stories about how this is all planned and this is all part of the diabolical strategy of Putin, and it's some kind of ethnic cleansing or that kind of thing. I don't think it's what the Russians are planning at all. I'm sure that's not what they're planning. But I think in practical terms, it's what would happen. You would have another mass refugee flow of several million people crossing over from Ukraine into Europe, and they would prefer to stay there. Why would they go back to a Ukraine which had failed them and which had failed so entirely?
They would go straight to Poland.
They would go straight to
Poland. And they would stay in Poland.
Well, they would go to Poland. They'd go to Germany.
Yeah, go to Germany.
They'd go to France. They'd go to all kinds of places like that. One place they couldn't go to now is Britain, where, of course, a lot of them previously did. But because, and that's the effect of Brexit for you. But people are, I think, not realistic about this. And the reason they're not realistic when they talk about partisan wars is because of the point we made at the start of this program, which is that there is a real Ukraine and there is a fictional one. It's the fictional one that you read about in the media. The real one is profoundly different. I was reading in the Daily Telegraph yesterday an absolutely bizarre article. I mean, parts of it were actually quite good, but there was one section about how Ukraine is gradually growing stronger. I mean, not a single factoid was produced to support that very bizarre claim. Anybody who knows the reality about what the true state of things in Ukraine is knows that the opposite is the truth. It's going through a political crisis. There's a sense of stagnation and decay across the economy. The sanctions that it imposed on Russia at Western encouragement have been disastrous for Ukraine. Living standards are falling, and it's never recovered to the level of 2013 before the Maidan events. And in 2013, Ukraine was still significantly poorer than it had been in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. So how people in the West can believe all this nonsense is difficult to understand. But we come back to this point about narrative constructors, that it's a construction of a narrative. But of course, when a narrative collides with the truth, with reality, it's reality that always wins through.
Yeah, and the funny part about all of this is that the EU does not want Ukraine in the European Union. No. The EU doesn't want Georgia in the European Union. They can't handle these countries into the European Union. That's a non-starter. The NATO doesn't want Ukraine or Georgia in NATO. They don't want them in there.
As Biden essentially admitted in his press conference. So why this cruel deception?
How come NATO just doesn't say it?
Exactly.
How come NATO just doesn't say, look, we have no plans whatsoever to include Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. Zero.
Exactly. I mean,
and that is the truth. That is
exactly. It's a cruel deception that's been spun on the Ukrainian people, that they will one day join, Ukraine will one day join NATO and the EU. And it's simply wrong. People just don't seem to grasp the fundamental dishonesty of the whole policy, if you like, of pretending to the Ukrainians that they will one day join NATO and the EU, when, of course, that will never happen. And what it's done is it's crucified Ukraine economically. It's created divisions within Ukraine. And the reason it's been done is not because the Western powers, as I said, are interested in Ukraine. It's because they're fixated with Russia, and they don't want a friendly Ukraine, a Ukraine that's friendly to Russia, because that will, of course, make Russia stronger. And that is ultimately what this whole thing is all about.
Yeah, and NATO can't come out and say it because, well, that would blow up their whole reason to exist. I mean, NATO is like it's like a multinational business without a product. It's like searching for a product to sell because it has nothing. There's no reason for it to even exist.
That is a brilliant thing. If you don't mind, Alex, I'm going to use that in future programs because I think that sums it up perfectly.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Just admit it. Come out and say it. That's all Russia's asking too, for NATO to just say, no, we're not going to, we have no interest in Ukraine, but they can't come out and say those words.
Yes.
And they can't put it in writing.
Yes. So before I go on, we've had some indications about what Blinken and Lavrov were talking about, and it looks exactly as I said, that in fact the Russians came along and demanded from Blinken some information about when these written responses would come. And Lavrov says, and this is the quote I have, Blinken told me he was satisfied with the exchange we had and that that it will help him. He assured us to issue a written response next week. However, their reaction is only preliminary. We were warned about this. So in other words, the Americans are still finding it very difficult to come up with a coherent response to the Russian demands. They put it back until next week. So all the thunder and hysteria that we've been hearing, the reality is that the Americans are trying to come up with a coherent response to the Russian proposals. And the entire purpose of this meeting seems to have been Blinken trying firstly to divert the discussion onto Ukraine and then promising Lavrov that we're actually going to get some kind of response next week, though it won't apparently even be a full one. And the Russians are waiting to see what the Americans come up with. So this meeting in Geneva was not high noon. It was not a high noon meeting, which is what, again, the Western media would want you to think.
Yeah. And so I guess this means that for another week, we're going to have more of this Russia is going to invade Ukraine hysteria
of course we are.
In order to cover for Biden's incompetence.
Of course we are, until we don't. That's the other comedy about this, because I was reading again somebody saying, that Putin has painted himself into a corner and he must do something because he will lose face if he doesn't. What corner has Putin painted himself into? He has consistently said that he has no plans to attack Ukraine. So if he doesn't attack Ukraine, how would he be humiliated?
He looks very worried. I saw him the other day. He was, going into the cold water for Epiphany. So yeah, Putin looks very, very worried about everything that's going on. And just a final note before we get to a lot of the questions and the super chats, Alexander, come February 4th, 2 weeks away, there is no chance in hell that Russia's going to, if Russia is planning to do something, there is no way in hell that Russia's going to do it during the Olympics in Beijing.
No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, that already put it back to late February. But I come back to this. The Russians, I am convinced, have no plan for an offensive against Ukraine. That doesn't mean that there won't be a war in Ukraine this winter.
Exactly.
But it is not the Russians who will initiate it.
Exactly.
And that's the key thing to understand about this.
Yeah, that has been our position from the get-go.
Yeah.
If they push Russia into a war, then okay, but only if Russia is pushed into it, and even then they're going to act very, very carefully. Like you said, they're going to calibrate their responses.
Absolutely.
And the big worry is that inside Ukraine, there's enough crazies there.
Yeah.
That they may start something.
Absolutely, no question. There are lots of people like that in Ukraine. I mean, there are lots of people like that in every country. But the problem is in Ukraine, they've been empowered. And that makes them extremely dangerous.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to it. We have a lot of good questions and comments awaiting us. Renat says 100 HK in place in place to go out on my Friday evening. Cheers from China. Thanks for your good work. Thank you very much, Renat, for that super chat. Thank you very, very much. Enjoy your Friday evening. Absolutely. And Valley S is in the house with a $20 super chat. Welcome, Valley S. Good to see you here. I also saw Cosmic Rain is with us as well, moderating. So welcome, Cosmic Rain, as well. Let's go. Brandon says, CV and Russia are made problems to slow down or stop the populist anti-globalist movements. The coup in Russia.
That's so profoundly true. I mean, this is exactly the point. One of the reasons for this huge anger towards Russia is, of course, when Putin came along and started reversing all the things that happened in the 90s. And the thing to always understand about Putin is that he never does things in a hurry. He's a very incremental and methodical man. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why he's popular and strong. Because this is another thing I need to say. This is a very sophisticated country. I think Westerners underestimate how sophisticated it is and how sophisticated the population in Russia is. I mean, they follow the news, they talk things through with each other, they understand exactly what the government and what Putin is up to. So the moment he came along and he started to incrementally turn things around, well, it became clear that the globalist project, as it was conceived in the 1990s, had a serious problem because Russia was such an important part of it. And of course, with every passing year, that problem has become bigger, and it's now threatening to become an existential one. Because, of course, Russia has become much stronger. And this is something we need to talk about, because please disregard all this nonsense about it, having a economy the size of Timbuktu. It's completely wrong. But as Russia has become stronger, as it is an ascending power, not a declining one, as it forges its links with China, as it forges its links with India, it's become increasingly clear that the globalist project is now in very, very serious trouble. And that is the underlying reason why we are in this state of hysteria at the moment. I don't even want to call it a crisis.
Yeah. I think pushing Russia into China is going to go down as one of the biggest foreign policy blunders in history.
It was a disastrous mistake.
Yeah.
Didn't have
really
to
was
happen.
A disastrous mistake.
It didn't have to happen. It was not certainly it was not where Putin wanted to be. I mean, that was not his initial intention. I think now, having decided to make the best of it, he's seen the advantages of it, and he's not going back on it. In fact, I think he likes it. But that was not the original plan. Initially, back in the early 2000s, he wanted to be friends with the West. He wanted to be friends, above all, with the United States. And that, I think, was also still very much the sentiment of most Russians. West pushed them away.
Yeah. All right. Mark Hewitt, super chat, the first super chat that came in. Bojo has to go. He may have got rid of mandates to save his job, but that has not stopped Bojo from enacting stupid policies such as replacing sacked care home workers with illegals crossing the channel.
Absolutely. The other thing that Bojo does is he presides over an extremely dangerous foreign policy. I mean, we have this very, very, very strange. He's probably in person a good man, but this very deluded and incompetent Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, who really does seem to believe that he's much cleverer than he really is. And, Ben Wallace wanted to keep Britain fighting by itself in Afghanistan, even after the Americans left. He's now sending light anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. He's written an absolutely ludicrous article. I mean, I read it the other day about Russian history and Ukrainian history, which simply exposed his own ignorance and exposed the fact that he has arguments with other NATO defense secretaries. So, Johnson has people like that in his cabinet. He has people like Liz Truss in his cabinet, people who go along parade around in a tank in Estonia. He sends aircraft carriers into the South China Sea, frigates near to Crimea. Very reckless and extremely dangerous stuff. Now, Johnson, as I've said, is not without his talents as a politician. He is, I think, in some respects, amongst mainstream politicians, the most talented and the most imaginative. But he is certainly not my idea of an optimal prime minister, and I'm never going to pretend that he is. I mean, it's much that he does I profoundly disagree with. Much that he does on domestic policy, I profoundly disagree with. Much that he's doing in foreign policy, well, in fact, the entirety of his foreign policy, I think is fundamentally wrong. That doesn't in any way change the fact that when he's focused, he does do some things which no other politician in Britain could have done. Like he plucked this Brexit deal out of thin air in 2019, and he's done the policy, this U-turn on the mandates. Impossible to imagine anyone else in Britain doing that, at least amongst mainstream politicians.
Yeah. From Toilet Sauce, well, the meeting between Blinken and Lavrov lasted a mere 1.5 hours, and they still didn't bring a written response to Russia's demands. The Biden administration is comprised of adult children, is stalling all they got.
Yeah, well, indeed, exactly. Well, stalling is all they got. But you know, the Russians predicted that would happen. I remember at the very start of all of this, when the Russians first presented their demands, they said that they expected that the Americans would want to divert the whole discussion by talking about irrelevant side issues, and that they would try to stall. And the Russians made it clear that they weren't prepared to accept that this time. So but. Adult children, I think that describes it exactly. Adult spoiled children, I would add. I mean, Blinken's speeches are very weird. I mean, they have an extraordinarily sulky quality. And there was a press conference he gave about 2 weeks ago, which I have to say, I thought it was frankly deranged, actually. I've lost the sound. Alex, I've lost sound.
1 sec, I had myself muted.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. From Amrit, can you suggest books on Russian history and Chinese history, if possible, written by Russian and Chinese historians?
Well, this is the great problem with Chinese history, because though I am extremely well informed about Chinese imperial history, it's not Chinese imperial history written by Chinese scholars, which is a real problem. It is I basically derived my knowledge about Chinese imperial history, which is the history that I'm really interested in, or used to be really interested in before I became, an international affairs commentator. But I mean, my base was the Cambridge Chinese history, which is this vast multi-term thing. I've actually got parts of it over there and whatever, and that is enormously detailed, is written by erudite scholars who love China, but of course it's not written by Chinese. And I supplemented it by, in terms of Chinese history, old Chinese history, by reading Chinese literature, which I find extremely interesting. I mean, and if you want me to recommend a novel for understanding Chinese, the Chinese people, well, I would recommend two. One is The Three Kingdoms, which is about this period of internecine war that happens after the fall of the Han Dynasty. And the other is The Story of the Stone. It's sometimes referred to as Dream of Red Mansions, but which is a horrible title. It's The Story of the Stone, which is a great Chinese novel of the 18th century. So those I would strongly recommend to understand Chinese people. Modern Chinese history, I really have to say, I think the quality of scholarship in the West is extremely poor. But for what it's worth, the person I look to most is a British scholar called Kerry Brown, whom I actually know, and he goes to China quite a lot, and he actually likes China. He has many criticisms of the Chinese government and of the Chinese political system, but he's also dismayed about some of the criticisms of China that are made nowadays. Now, he is enormously prolific. I mean, the number of books he's written is just beyond belief, and not all of them are very good. Or at least not all of them. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that if he's watching us. But I don't think, many of them, frankly, I think are just potboiler things. But overall, I do think he's perhaps one of the more level-headed people. Now, Chinese scholars, I have none. If you're talking about Russian history, well, there are lots of good Russian historians. But again, I would recommend the Yale History series. This is produced by Yale University. It brings together all sorts of really very fine scholars. And the interesting thing is that you have teams of American and Russian scholars working together and collaborating together on discussing modern Russian history. And people like Gabriel Gorodetsky, J. Arch Getty, those sort of people. There's Gantz, who has written so much about the Second World War, and that's all accessible in English. And as I said, it is based a lot on Russian scholarship. If you want to go for earlier histories about the Russian Empire, well, the absolute stand-away best historian there is Dominic Lieven. And his book on the 1812 war, the war against Napoleon, is a masterpiece. And he's followed it up with some great histories about the politics of the late Tsarist Empire. Oh, right. And one very last person I should mention is George Katkoff, who wrote books about the Russian Revolution. You want to understand the lead up to the Russian Revolution, you must read Katkoff, who is Russian, white Russian. He was in St. Petersburg, in Petrograd, at the time when the Tsar abdicated. And he knew people personally, people like Kerensky and people like this. Russia 1917 is one of his books, and the Kornilov Affair is another.
Yeah, you should put those on like Locals or something.
I will.
That'd be helpful.
Indeed.
Yeah. All right. From Locals, Leafybug says, I have to say that I was quite impressed that Biden made it through the extended press conference. Sure, he was jacked up on something that was clearly wearing off at the end.
Yeah.
And he said a bunch of stuff that clearly indicates he doesn't really understand what's going on. But from a purely cosmetic perspective, he made it through without dissolving into an incoherent mess. That being said, I can see why he only does this once a year. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree with that so profoundly. I agree with this completely. The only problem is, of course, doing that created a mini political crisis. I mean, it's created an international crisis because, an itsy bitsy little Russian incursion isn't going to be a problem. And I mean, it was very surreal in places, and it's created real issues for the US in Europe. And of course, it also exposed the extent of NATO divisions in handling Russia. By the way, I don't want to talk too much, but it's increasingly looking like these sanctions that we're hearing about, the sanctions from hell, are going to be no such thing. With each iteration, they're looking like they're becoming increasingly less effective. So no disconnection from SWIFT. Big Russian banks not going to be allowed to use the dollar. But of course, it seems they will continue to be allowed to use the euro. And most of Russian trade is in euros. And most Russian reserves are in euros. So I wonder really what exactly people think this is going to do. It seems to me the only real sanctions are going to be stopping iPhones and cancelling Nord Stream 2. The first will not be good for Apple, and the second will not be good for Germany. So I'm not quite sure where these
bad for Europe.
Bad for Europe, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's looking less impressive all the time.
Yeah, great. We're just going to pay more for our energy. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon. Let's see, from JK Win. First SC usually have to watch, later in California. Stayed up till 2. Say thanks for video. Yes, after losing mind hearing from independent YouTube with establishment talk and low info people thinking it's the Dems versus Republicans, not remembering Iraq WMD lies.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
People forget about Iraq WMDs.
Oh, of course, it never happened. I mean, Iraq never happened. I mean, go back to Ben Wallace's bizarre history. I mean, he was talking about, what a wonderful defensive alliance NATO is, and he said, NATO's defensive to its core. Well, tell that to the people of Yugoslavia. Tell that to the people of Libya. Tell that to people in Afghanistan. Yeah. I mean, and of course, he doesn't mention this. He never mentions any of that. I mean, is it because he doesn't know? Is it because he's stupid? Is it because he can't compute it? It's very weird to read things like this.
Yeah, especially coming from someone in his position.
Well,
exactly. Raphael says, give me credit. New coalition, anti-NATO, China, Russia, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, Afghanistan, joint exercises, tell it all. I am Nostradamus. Raphael, you are now Nostradamus. We give you full credit. Excellent analysis from Raphael.
Well, you're not like Nostradamus, because Nostradamus was a charlatan. And he got most of what he said was wrong.
Raphael, you're not Nostradamus.
You are far. So don't compare yourself to Nostradamus. Okay, you're telling it as it actually will be.
All right. Thank you, Raphael, for that. And Sanjeva says, how refreshing to watch Tucker Carlson. He is an oasis of reality in a desert of clickbait news this week.
So, absolutely right.
He is one of the people that gets Ukraine and gets basically U.S. foreign policy right. Yeah, I mean, you have to give him credit for that.
Absolutely.
He does see through a lot of the BS.
Absolutely. It's becoming quite interesting that the British media with Tucker, they're now starting to avoid mentioning him by name. So, for example, I read a piece in the Financial Times. I think it was by Gideon Rachman, who's one of the usual sort of people who write in the Financial Times. And he talked about this far-right, populist, extremist commentator, and provided a link. And then you have to go through. Find it stuck.
Can't even say his name.
Can't even say his name.
Wow. That they're jealous.
Yeah.
When they can't say your name, they are jealous.
Exactly.
Oh, good job for Tucker. He's doing an incredible job. I have to say. Basha B says, how much of the Ukraine hysteria is a result of Biden and the EU having serious issues at home? Foreign policy and blaming the Russians. 101 diversion.
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. We've done a program about this, Alex and I, which I said I'm starting increasingly to think that a lot of this crisis was some kind of botched, bungled attempt to stage a kind of false, a phony Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, with Biden playing the part of JFK and, facing down, the evil Khrushchev stroke Putin type of person, which, but of course, only the trouble is, this isn't a real crisis, whereas the Cuban Missile Crisis emphatically was. And Biden isn't JFK, so it hasn't worked out like that. But I generally do believe that there is a strong element of this. So we have all these threats, all these warnings, all these things. But when you peel down, it doesn't even amount to anything. And what was the point of sending Blinken going all the way to Geneva to meet Lavrov? He's not going to tell him anything. That's again, it was sold. This meeting was sold to the media as a sort of high noon event. It's nothing.
It's all theatrics.
It's all theatrics. It's all. There's no reality to any of this.
But it's like you said, the people, like if you live in Ukraine, it's, you look at this stuff and you say, what the hell do I do? If you're just a normal person there, do I take my money out of the bank? Do I move? What the hell do I do?
Exactly.
Because you don't know what the hell's going on.
Exactly.
Anyway. Oh boy. And bank runs are not fun. Capital controls and bank runs are not fun at all. Anyway, let's see. Alan Watson says, is Russia looking for confrontation in the Middle East? Also China. A false move by Israel could trigger a heightening of tension.
Russia's not looking for a confrontation in the Middle East. That doesn't mean one won't happen. That's always the important thing to say. My own sense is that the events in the Middle East are now starting to take a very, very strong turn, and in a kind of a way, you could almost say that they're going in the Russians' favor. When I say the Russians' favor, I should always include that, the Chinese Russians' favor. This is in parentheses because recently Lavrov actually spoke of Team China-Russia. That they are one team essentially. But we've had Ebrahim Raisi, the Iranian president in Moscow, seeking a strategic partnership with the Russians. We've had Saudi Arabia mending its fences with Iran and reopening diplomatic missions in Tehran, with an Iranian diplomatic mission in Saudi. We have a slow drawdown, a quiet drawdown, apparently, of US troops in Syria, and we have all of these moves going on, and signs that the situation in the Middle East is starting to stabilize. The Israeli situation is completely unresolved. The Arab-Israeli situation is completely unresolved. The Russians, Putin, by the way, spoke to Bennett, the Israeli prime minister. He's always careful to do that. He spoke to Bennett before he met Raisi in Moscow. So he was clearly wanting to brief the Israelis about what was happening. The Russians are very careful about ticking these boxes and making the other side, the Israelis, know what they're going to do. They're trying to keep this thing in some kind of balance. Problem with the Middle East is that trying to build a long-term policy there is so difficult because the region is so unstable and so volatile. I once heard it described as trying to build a castle on a foundation of sand. You build it up, it all looks very impressive, and then suddenly it all crumbles. And the Russians experienced that in the 60s and early 70s, when their previous attempt to involve themselves in the Middle East simply unraveled. And it's possible that it could do so again. So I don't think they're looking for a confrontation. I think they're trying to manage their relations with the Israelis. I think they're trying to manage all of these relationships. But it is incredibly time-consuming. There must be some people in Moscow who say, is this all ultimately worthwhile? What are we in practical terms achieving by all of this? And yes, we've stabilized Syria, which is important, but let's hold on to that. Let's mend our fences to some extent with Iran, and let's let the rest of the region go, because frankly, it's not a great concern to us. And we don't want a confrontation with Israel, because when we were in confrontation with Israel in the 70s, it turned out very badly for us. So I think that they're not looking for confrontation, but it doesn't follow that their current policies in the Middle East will ultimately turn out the way that they perhaps would like them to.
All right. Thank you, Yefen, for that super sticker. And from Toilet Sauce, I will never forget what Putin said at a press conference after the war in Georgia. Quote, "We will smack you in the face as hard as you deserve it." End quote.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when Putin speaks like that, which he does from time to time, when he comes out and talks in that fashion, then of course it can be pretty. It's very blunt and it's very frank and it's electrifying, and that is one example. And by the way, when he does it, because he's an extraordinarily. This is something that I should say. I noticed this on the only 2 occasions I've seen Putin in person. I mean, I was in a room with thousands of people, but this was in 2 conferences I attended in St. Petersburg. He's generally a very polite, very well-spoken man, but he can come out with these incredible statements. And when he does, they cut through. People notice them. And precisely because nearly all the rest of the time he is so polite, so you're quite right. And, sooner or later, maybe we'll be having similar comments from Putin after this whole situation plays out.
Yes. And we have another super chat from Toilet Sauce, a €50 super chat. Thank you very much, Toilet Sauce, for that. And the chat says, the West has never understood a fundamental fact of Russian culture. If you make a promise, you better keep it. It is considered incredibly rude and insulting to break your promise. If you can't keep it, at least have the decency to apologize.
Absolutely. And you're so right about this. And can I just say, one person who understood that was the one Western leader, if we can call him that, who understood the Russians very well, and that was Bismarck. And there's a wonderful quote from Bismarck which makes exactly the point that you said. Now, I can't remember it exactly, the exact words, and of course the exact words are in German, but he said that the important thing to understand about the Russians is that they always, in the end, come for their money. Never think that you can trick them for very long. Never think that you can bully them into agreements that, when they're weak, that will, make them give up their demands for their money, because eventually you'll find that whatever agreements you think you have like that, agreements forced on them when they're weak, that they're not really worth anything. Always with the Russians, play straight or not at all. That was what Bismarck said. And it's so true. It's, by the way, also true in personal relations with Russians. I mean, I have a few Russian friends. And one of the things you very quickly find about this is they don't like being lied to. Russians really don't like being lied to. And the Western powers have never understood that. This constant harping, for example, that you get from the West, these endless mantras that the West never promised not to expand NATO eastward. When, of course it did. It's all over the place. There's written proof of it in place after place after place about this. This constant lying about this is something that really annoys Russians in a way that I think Westerners don't understand. Far more straightforward. Say the promises were made, the promises were broken. We're very sorry, but we can't really go back now. We can only regret that happened in that way. But we apologize, and let's try and find some kind of way forward. That is how to treat with that. That would be a much better way of treating with the Russians than continuing to lie about something which every Russian knows that those promises were given.
Yeah. From Flying Boar, will Russia put their nukes in Belarus and Kaliningrad?
Possibly. They've not ruled it out. I mean, and the change to the Belarusian constitution now makes that possible. And that can't just be chance. I mean, previously it wasn't possible because the constitution prevented it. But now the new draft of the constitution makes it possible. So maybe.
From Kurt, the US-EU need a distraction for a coming huge monetary crash. No. The cuff has lost its luster, so the risk of a Russia-China conflict is higher than ever. Thank you very much, Kurt, for that.
That's absolutely true. That goes directly to the point Alex was making, and I can understand that. I buy that. I mean, I'm not saying I know it, but it wouldn't surprise me. And in fact, I'm going to go further. I'm sure there are some people in the DNC, for example, who are thinking in exactly that way.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure there's some think tank somewhere that's crafting that narrative as we speak.
Exactly.
And Zarael says, I must sadly agree with Kurt.
Yeah.
So Zarael is on board with that as well. Yeah. From Indigo Jones, I hear heating prices are very high in the UK, Alexander. Can you give us an example of how much this has inflated this winter?
Well, it hasn't yet because, of course, we have the price cap. I mean, I can speak for myself. I mean, I've noticed a doubling. But
what?
Well, okay. I mean, I have a large house, so it's. My fuel prices are pretty high. But of course, what I'm hearing is that in April, it's going to more than double again. So we're going to have a quadrupling since the start of this winter. And the thing about fuel prices in Britain is that when they go up, they never really go down again. So it's going to create a huge upward leap, and then of course we'll see what happens. And all of this coming on top of inflation crisis, a cost of living crisis, is going to hit people very, very badly.
Yeah. From Kurt, the neocons want to cut off the EU from Russia to get the EU countries on board to such a distraction. Not possible with a strong EU-Russia trade relationship.
So true. And that's essentially what Macron was hinting at. You go back to Macron's speech. Macron's point was that for the EU to achieve notional independence, I mean, I think that's a horrible idea, by the way. I mean, but Macron, always with Macron, his objective is to create this federal Europe. But he understands that this federal Europe, if it's going to be really independent and a real force in the world, which I think is a lunatic project, but remember, that's his project. He understands that can only work if he has a good relationship with Russia, because it needs Russian energy, raw materials, food, all those sort of things going into the EU. And that's why he wants a rapprochement with Russia. And of course, those who don't want a rapprochement with Russia definitely include people in the US and other people who want to keep the EU very tied to the United States, not this great independent actor that Macron is talking about. The problem is that the level of interdependence is already so great that severing the link would create a serious crisis, not just a serious crisis, conceivably an existential crisis in the European economy. And that's something European leaders hadn't understood, I think, until this winter. I think this winter is finally hit them home.
Yeah. Tristan says, would Russia seize Kiev if we do see a conflict and Russia's hand is forced to offensive action by the West and NATO?
It's possible. It's possible. I don't think that's the plan. And we come back to that point that Alex and I were making at the start of this program, which is that the Russian response would be calibrated. If, as I said, it was simply a case of an Ukrainian incursion into the Donbass, for example, one which didn't go very far, you would probably see Russian artillery, which, by the way, is overwhelmingly powerful. It far exceeds anything that Ukraine can put together and is infinitely more accurate. You would see Russian artillery basically, blasting at the Ukrainians, but it might not go beyond that. If there was an all-out Ukrainian offensive, then you could see a massive Russian counterattack and an envelopment and an attempt to control eastern Ukraine, but not go beyond the Dnieper River, for example. Or alternatively, if there was an attempt by the Western powers to reinforce Ukraine by perhaps even threatening to send troops to central Ukraine, then of course at that point the Russians would move further, might choose to move further east, and then of course possibly Kiev. But these are scenarios that are speculative. We mustn't, I think, speculate too far, because of course I'm sure that there are plans in Moscow, in the general staff, to deal with every conceivable contingency. But that doesn't mean that the fact that those plans exist means that there is an actual intention at the moment to implement those plans. And at the moment, as I said, I don't think the Russians are anticipating are intending to launch any kind of general offensive in Ukraine, including, of course, Kiev.
Yeah. Indigo Jones, what is Biden, Macron, Boris, and all the good old boys declare a war and nobody comes? What if? Nobody comes? It's possible. I can't see a European country taking part in any type of
there was an opinion poll a couple of years ago.
That's for sure.
There was an opinion poll a couple of years ago, which showed how Europeans are basically not prepared to fight for each other. So I mean, it's quite likely they wouldn't come.
They would have come. From Amrit, an Atlantic Council article wants to share the American propaganda that Russia needs Western machinery for manufacturing. Are they living in a parallel world? As for the U.S. itself, its imports of 65% of machines it uses.
This is so profoundly true. This is so completely. I mean, I'm glad you brought this up. Can I just give an example? And it's an example that relates to the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2014. Now, those sanctions took three forms. There was financial sanctions, so that the Russian banks couldn't borrow in Western money markets. There was sanctions against the Russian energy industry. To prevent, drilling equipment and machinery going to the Russian energy industries. And then there was what were called dual-use sanctions, which basically were to stop machine tools and turbines and things like that. Now, the point about the third was that the Russians at that time were still importing a lot of their machinery, this kind of equipment, from Ukraine, which is very much a key part of the Russian in the Soviet industrial system. And Ukraine, of course, imposed sanctions. It stopped exports. So the expectation was that Russia wouldn't be able to borrow because the banks couldn't borrow. The oil industry would gradually decline because it wouldn't be able to maintain levels of production without imports of Western equipment. And so the oil fields and the gas fields would gradually decline, and that would mean that financial flows would come to a stop, and Russian industry would gradually start to clog up because they weren't getting the machine tools and the equipment from Ukraine, and they couldn't replace it because of the sanctions. That was the strategy in 2014. How has it actually turned out? Well, Russia replaced very quickly all the equipment for its oil and gas industry that it imported from the West. Russian oil and gas, instead of falling, has actually increased. And they've developed their big liquefied natural gas projects in the Arctic. So that part of it didn't work. And as a result, the financial stream from gas and oil revenues continued to arrive, and the restrictions on the banks didn't really achieve anything. And in fact, it all led to the financial system in Russia becoming essentially self-sufficient and disconnected anyway from that of the West. And as for all the other machinery imports, well, the Russians are now building their own aircraft. They're building their own gas turbines. They're building more and more of their machine tools. They now make microchips, by the way, perhaps not in quantities like Taiwan or Korea, but they do. Maybe they're not as advanced as those in Taiwan and Korea, but they make them. And the result is we have this idiotic situation where the Western powers are now actually complaining to the World Trade Organization about the fact that the Russians have been so successful in their import substitution program. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that the Russians are able to import machinery and things and microchips and things like that from China and places like that. So this whole conception of sanctions is based on a completely flawed model of today's Russian economy. It might have been true of Russia in, say, 1996, at the worst period in the 1990s. It has no connection to the Russia of today. And one of the most telling things, one of the most startling things about Biden's press conference is that Biden again said that oil and gas accounts for 45% of Russia's GDP. And that isn't remotely true. It's more like 10%. And he's the president of the United States. Well, he's Joe Biden, so perhaps his attention span isn't very strong. But nobody in the press challenged that figure. And you still see it repeated in all kinds of places by people who should know better.
That's the problem. It gets repeated.
Yeah.
From Hunger, if Russia invades, will they cut off the West Ukraine from the sea by taking Odessa? Is the population still pro-Russia after years of Maidan agitprop?
My understanding is that it isn't just pro-Russian, but perhaps even more so. And I hear stories that the boys, the local boys, do all kinds of things at night, putting up all kinds of things, protest things, and there's even some, apparently you get street fights and things between pro-Russian boys and boys who brought in from other cities, and all cut brawls and things like that go on. So yes, I think Odessa remains very pro-Russian, and moreover, again, it depends very much on how far Ukraine itself goes, but a Russian advance all the way to Odessa is a real possibility, and it would cut off Ukraine from the sea. And at that point, Ukraine ceases, it seems to me, to be viable as an economic unit, because Ukraine needs those ports. It needs that access to the sea in order to sell its grain and to import its goods.
Yeah. I think it would also solve a lot of the issues with Transnistria.
Absolutely, well. Of course, yeah. It would bring the Russians right up to the borders with Moldova, and then that Russian garrison in Transnistria is not isolated any longer.
Yeah. From Kurt, a war between Russia and Ukraine with the participation of NATO will, for Europe, make the coup look like a holiday.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's been ruled out. Even the United States accept, apart from some imbeciles like Senator Wicker, even the United States has said it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you, William, for your super chat, and thank you, Maria, for your super sticker. And from Freedom Autopsy Report, what is the difference between quantitative easing as practiced by the United States and the devaluation of the Turkish currency?
Well, they are very similar in the sense that Turkey obviously is massively overspending, and the fact that Turkey is now giving money to people to make up for the fact that when the lira falls, as I've said already, I mean, whatever it does, even if it persuades people temporarily to hold on to their lira, all it's going to do is it's going to fuel inflationary pressures in Turkey, which, as I understand it, it is actually doing. I mean, there's been complaints from business associations in Turkey now, including an important pro-Erdogan one, that this is not a good policy. But Turkey can't do an open QE exercise in the way that the United States is doing. In practice, they are very similar. As I said, they are both a form of currency debasement, but one mustn't compare the US dollar with the Turkish lira. The US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. It's a currency that people still want to have, and it would take an awful lot of QE, an awful lot of debasement before people dropped it, and it found itself in the kind of situation that the Turkish lira is.
Yeah. From Filipina Traveler TV, I was happy to hear, Alexander, in the last video that a potential new UK Prime Minister would not bring back the coup restrictions. Happy weekend.
I'm absolutely convinced of it. Even if Keir Starmer were to become Prime Minister, he wouldn't do it.
Yeah. He would have a hard time doing it. That's for sure.
He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. There would be so much resistance, and there'd be opposition within his own party.
Yeah. From J. Galt, 1776. Yesterday, the U.S. Department released Russia's top 5 persistent disinformation narratives. They claim color revolutions are a Russian myth.
Well, of course they are. They never happened. Color revolutions didn't take place in any country. I mean, those pictures that you saw of Victoria Nuland handing out cookies and of European officials turning up on Maidan Square. Well, that never happened. I mean,
or Libya.
This is all. I mean, this sort of thing is silly, frankly. And again, it would be better if the United States didn't make a fool of itself by publishing these sort of things.
Yeah, well, they do it so that the Washington Post and the New York Times can then pick it up.
Absolutely, and of course,
circular type of,
and of course, the risk is, and this is where I'm afraid we in our channel have to be always on the lookout for this thing, which is that now the State Department says that color revolutions are a Russian myth. So eventually, it becomes
the Duran is fake news, right?
Exactly. So you and then of course you start making kinds of restrictions on people who talk about color revolutions.
That's why they do it. So this stuff can get picked up by the New York Times, Washington Post, which then gets picked up by CNN, MSNBC, which then gets amplified by Twitter and Facebook, and that's why they do it. Indigo Jones says, what happens when the Republicans win the midterm majority in Congress and the MAGA faction makes good on threats to impeach Biden for Ukraine Burisma? It's possible.
Well, it is absolutely possible, and it must be. It's one of the reasons I haven't talked much about American politics because, of course, it's very difficult to do so on YouTube. But the nervousness in the US is extraordinary on the Democrat side. I mean, they're absolutely spooked about this, and you read article after article when they talk about democracy being in danger. What they of course mean is the Democratic Party being in danger and the Democratic Party's president being in danger. Now, I am going to be extremely careful what I say now, but I find it very, very interesting that there's all sorts of complaints now about the Republicans doing things to ensure that they win the elections. And the fact that, the election outcomes might be illegitimate. All this coming from people who insist that American elections are always perfect and that no outcome can ever be illegitimate. So, be prepared for all of that. I can very easily, very quickly see how the narrative is going to flip before very long.
Yeah, they're starting the narrative manipulation right now. All right, from Renat, in place to go out on my. Oh, I already read that from Renat. Thank you very much, Renat. And from Mike Watts, what influence do you think Boris's announcement for the rollback of the CUF restrictions will have on other European leaders who are currently moving in the opposite direction?
Indeed, Austria, I saw, made a decision in the opposite direction just now.
They approved it.
Indeed, my own personal view is that with Britain taking one line, the whole thing is now going to become unsustainable, and that over the next few weeks and months, you're going to see them all change direction entirely, and that we are in the last days of the CUF, at least of the policies relating to the CUF. I think that Britain was the place where it all changed.
Yeah, I agree. It was a watershed moment. From Ellen, can you? Yeah,
it was a watershed moment.
Yeah. Can you tell us about Russia, Mali, the Wagner Group, and France? What is happening?
People have. I had the same question on locals on my locals live stream on Wednesday. Well, briefly, can I just say a few things about Mali? Mali is this enormous country in West Africa. Culturally, by the way, very brilliant. And I understand that Bamako, the capital, it's a place where it's a very much a going on sort of place. It's a thriving, extraordinary, bustling, culturally brilliant place. Very poor, like a lot of West Africa is, but an interesting country. Well, it was part of the French colonial West African Empire, but that all disintegrated in the 1960s. For a time in the 1960s, it was led by a pro-Soviet communist government, led by a president, I think his name was President Keita at the time. Then there was a coup in, I think, 1968. A new president, a military man, came in who ran Mali until the early 2000s, or it might have been the 90s, I'm not exact, but a very, very, very long time. He was pro-French. It fell very much under French control, though even the military government was still kept up a good relationship with the Soviets. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. It became essentially once more dominated by France, very much part of French West Africa, which is integrated. Many of them use the same currency, those sort of things. And then, of course, instability began when the Western powers, including, of course, France, overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And that led to jihadi upswing in West Africa. Remember, Libya is also part of West Africa. The southern regions are part there. And anyway, so that led to massive increase in jihadi fighters pouring into Mali. The northern regions of Mali, which are culturally different from the sort of southern ones, looked as if they might break away. And the Malian government turned to France, its protector, and the French sent troops to try to defend Mali. And by most accounts, they've done a very mediocre job. And a couple of years ago, the Malian government collapsed. There was another military coup. The French used that as an excuse to pull out of Mali. And the new military government, faced with that, still worried about this jihadi insurgency in the north of Mali, then turned to Russia. The Russians were not prepared to send their own troops to Mali, but they did send these mercenaries through the Wagner Group. Now, can I just say, I think the Wagner Group is a sordid, squalid, horrible thing. I wish it didn't exist. I don't like it. I don't like mercenaries and all that kind of thing. That's my own personal feelings. I know others may have other feelings about this, but those are personally mine. But anyway, the Russians sent people into Mali in the form of the Wagner Group to take over where the French had left off. And of course, this has created a huge amount of worry in France and in the European Union. There was a bizarre meeting between Lavrov and Josep Borrell, the utterly, I think, deranged high representative for foreign affairs that the European Union has. Borrell apparently told Lavrov, stay out of Mali. Mali is ours. Apparently, he actually used an expression even as crude as that. Lavrov apparently said, well, he said no. I was going to use stronger words, but anyway, he said no. And the result was that the Russians looked like they were going to become embedded in Mali. Now, what's happened recently, as I understand it, is that the French have shown some interest in going back in, and the US, which doesn't want the Russians in Mali, has indicated that it is going to back the French if they go back into Mali and, working with the Malian government to fight the jihadi fighters. And if that happens, then it's quite likely that these mercenaries, these Wagner people, will leave. And I do wonder whether the military government invited them in the first place as leverage in order to get the French to come back and to get the Americans to side with them. So that's my own understanding of it. Now, I've heard, however, that one consequence of all of this is that if you go to Bamako, you see lots of Russian flags everywhere, and people saying Russia welcome. That there's that sort of thing. So even though the Russian presence may be very ephemeral, it's left some goodwill behind it.
Yeah. From Raul, with the COOF vax mandates in the toilet, will the protests in Europe start to get violent?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. First of all, I should make it clear, I don't countenance or support violence, but I wouldn't be surprised because, of course, what has happened, and this is important to understand, is that people were being led to believe this time last year that we were, at the beginning of the end of this. And with the jabs and everything like that, it was all going to come to an end. And then in the autumn, suddenly we get the new variant. There's attempts to clamp down. People are given the impression that this is going to go on forever. And I think people have had enough. And when people have had enough, if it's something like this is imposed on them, then you will start to see protests, and those protests will become angry protests. And when people are angry, stuff happens.
Yeah. From Amrit, Russia and China liberation of Ukraine, borderland, and Taiwan Island, respectively, would bring good dose of defeat to the American jokers. Being separated by two oceans has made them overconfident.
I think that is true. I think in terms of the political class in Washington, they are very remote from the consequences of the things that have, that the United States does around the world. And I agree. I think that if they were to lose in that kind of way, it would be a massive shock to them, and a shock like they've never experienced before. I'm going to add something else. I read a commentary in a Chinese newspaper some time ago, in which said that for China, Taiwan is the major problem in its international relations, in its foreign policy. If the problem of Taiwan is solved, yes, there will be a period of huge anger, great tension, more sanctions, more blockades over against China. But ultimately, China is a huge country. It can absorb all of this. The festering sore of Taiwan will have gone. And eventually, just as happened in the 1970s, the Western powers will have to come to terms with China. And I'm sure there are people in Russia who think saying the same. There are almost certainly people who are suggesting to Putin. And, I'm sure there are people who like that, who have access to Putin and who are saying to him, look, let's solve this Ukraine problem once and for all. Yes, sanctions will be imposed on us. Yes, it will be tough for us for a while, tougher even for them, though. But at the end of the day, the problem will have gone, and then we can start to straighten out relations with the West in the future when they get off their high horses and stop being angry. Now, I don't think Putin is accepting that kind of advice. As we discussed in this earlier part of the program, that's not how he works. That's not how the Russian government works. And it's quite clear that the current Chinese government isn't accepting that kind of advice about Taiwan either. But over time, it's possible that these voices will grow in power in both Moscow and Beijing. And that's not something you should overlook.
From Zarael says, this is a game of who will blink in first. Who will blink in first. Thank you, Zarael, for that. And
his eyebrows flutter quite a lot. That's what I can say.
Yes. He's a strange character.
He's a very strange guy. I mean, he's the weirdest foreign Secretary of State I can remember.
Yeah, well, that says a lot.
And that says a lot.
When you look at Hillary Clinton and who else, Madeleine Albright.
Hillary Clinton, I could understand actually. I knew what she was about. I mean, it was a case of grifting. I mean, that was basically what that was all about, or so it seems to me. Blinken is a very weird character.
From Sparky, sorry, off topic, but letting Djokovic play in the Australian Open is like letting Victor Laszlo stay in Casablanca. What if he were to inspire people to sing La Marseillaise?
Marseillaise. Absolutely. One of the most moving scenes in cinema, by the way. I agree. Actually, I get the point entirely. It's a perspective, I must admit, I'd completely missed, and it may explain a great deal. What I would still say is that the better thing to have done would have been not to make a big issue of this at all. Just let him come, let him go. I doubt that it would have had that kind of electrifying effect. But after his visa was reinstated, perhaps that fear that he would become a kind of Victor Laszlo would have been a real one.
From Ryan, 2 questions. If snap elections did occur and Boris is removed, do conservatives lose or gain seats with the slim coup advantage? Second question, I've seen reports Orban is in good position in Hungary. Is that true?
Right. Let's deal with the first. My own personal view is that the Conservatives have lost a lot of support over the last few weeks because of the way in which this situation has played out. And you've seen I mean, now over the last week or so, there's actually been a slight improvement, well, an improvement in the Labour Party's poll rating. I think it's ephemeral. I think that if Boris stabilises the situation and consolidates his position, it's quite possible we will see polling reverse again. And it's not inconceivable that a new prime minister, a new Conservative prime minister, might have a big upward bump in the polls as well. So if there was an election in a couple of months' time, I suspect that the results of 2019 would probably reproduce themselves. That's my own feeling. The risk the Conservatives run is if they descend into a prolonged civil war. If that happens, if there's a huge civil war within the Conservative Party, then that could sap energy and drain confidence. And then, and only then, I can imagine the country turning to Starmer.
Yeah. And real quick, Hungary, Ukraine.
Oh, Hungary, Ukraine.
Looks like Hungary, Ukraine.
Hungary polling.
Orban,
I have heard the same thing. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, the opposition seemed to be ahead in the polls. I understand that things have reversed themselves and that Orban is now moving ahead again. But I won't pretend that I follow this extreme, especially closely. I still think Orban will win because, straightforwardly, he is the colossus in Hungarian politics. The people, this weird coalition that's been cobbled together against him, bringing together the Social Democrats, in other words, the ex-communists, with the Jobbik party, the people who used to be fascists but who now say they aren't. I mean, it's such a weird and outlandish coalition. It makes so little sense, and I think it's so unconvincing that, except in a few places like Budapest, where obviously it's the cosmopolitan atmosphere there is pro-EU and all the rest, I think in most places you will see Orban win, and I expect that he will hold on to power. But it'll still, I think, be a tough battle. But my understanding is that he's now moving ahead.
All right. Raul says people are living in an illusion, thinking that the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. U.S. debt is its Achilles heel.
I think the United States is still a hugely powerful country. And I think if the United States puts aside all these imperial ambitions, I think, and I've said this many, many times, I think all the problems that we see in the US would begin to sort themselves out very fast. Yes, there is huge debt in the United States, and yes, it is a burden. But if you start focusing on the productive side of the US economy, if you start fostering and building that up, instead of getting distracted by foreign policy adventures, distracting by the culture wars, distracted by this vast arms industry, which, to be very clear, is draining the energy of the US industrial base, because it means that the best engineers, the best technologists are busy making weapons rather than building the kind of consumer products and other such products that the US excelled in. If all of that righted itself, then you'd see the economy surge. And at that point, the problems with the debt would start to look much more manageable. And you'd also have a proper currency again.
America first.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely. America first. And, this is one of the things that really I find it utterly bewildering that the policy of America first, some people in America are trying to give it a bad name. Why should it? I just don't understand. It tells you so much, doesn't it? That,
it makes
putting
no sense.
your own country first is supposed to be populist and wrong. I mean, what kind of skewed logic is that?
It isn't logic at all.
It isn't logic.
It isn't logic at all, yeah. From Sparky, I wouldn't be surprised if most able-bodied people in Ukraine are culturally Russian. Able-bodied cultural Ukrainians are in the Ukrainian diaspora.
I agree, actually. I think you're probably right. I would say there's an awful lot of Russians or Ukrainians who've gone to Russia as well. So, it's not just Western Ukrainians going to Europe. But overall, I wouldn't be surprised if you're absolutely right. Apparently now there's announcements on the metro in Kiev. Just please don't use Russian, which implies that many people do. Otherwise, why say it?
Yeah, it is their first language for
absolutely
a large percentage of the population.
I understand that in private, it's still the preferred language of most people, actually.
Yeah, well, there were news reports that when the coup was going on and they were finalizing the details, that even like Yatsenyuk and these guys were speaking in Russian, and that Poroshenko's Ukrainian is actually very, very bad as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've heard that they can't speak Ukrainian too well, but anyway, those are just the reports that we get from Kurt. Replacing Boris will mean someone who is more pro-war, EU-friendly, and more coup restrictions. For now, He is the best choice for the most people.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. And when I said I didn't like Boris's foreign policy, I didn't mean to suggest that the alternatives to him would provide for anything better. On the contrary, it would probably be worse. Coming back to Boris, as I said before, he is the one politician in Britain who's shown an ability to think outside the box. And that might even affect foreign policy eventually. He's the kind of person who would, could quite conceivably suddenly change everything round. Go to Moscow, for example, meet Putin, do a deal with him. Impossible to imagine Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Kwarteng, or dare I say it, Keir Starmer, doing anything like that. So, I didn't want to imply when I said that I have many criticisms of Boris and that I don't like his foreign policy, that I think the others would be better. On the contrary, they would be at least as bad, and in the sense that they might actually believe in it, they might be worse.
Yeah. He is the best option around, it seems. Yeah. From Kurt, Bitcoin is crashing, 38.5K USD, and Mr. Bat Out of Hell, Meatloaf, has just died. Yes, I heard about Meatloaf as well.
On the first, I'm going to simply say nothing because I'm not an expert on Bitcoin. All I would say is that I've heard about its crashes and its.
You've heard about Russia's decision. Well, the legislation that Russia has about cryptocurrency.
I know. But again, in the usual Russian way, they've now issued an announcement. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to hold Bitcoin. It's all about mining, apparently. Very Russian. The Russians have this expression which comes back from a poem, which is that Russian laws would be unbelievably oppressive if they were ever enforced rigorously.
Yeah.
So just do bear that in mind.
Yeah. And for Meatloaf, rest in peace.
Rest in peace, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kurt, for that. Tim Gibson says, we'll now get to hear DeSantis is foreign policy.
Well, indeed, and that's a very good point because I haven't heard much from him about foreign policy. But we'll see.
We have to wait and see what Trump does first.
Well, indeed, yes, yes. By the way, we did a program about this phony narrative of Trump and DeSantis quarreling about with each other, and I was very, very interested to see an article in the Federalist making exactly the same points after we did our program. Somebody made exactly the same points of the story about Trump and DeSantis being adversaries is clearly a Democrat Party operation.
Yeah, those anonymous sources.
Those anonymous.
From Sparky, Blinken's using credit from past administrations, which no longer exists. He's at the checkout counter and can't understand why his card doesn't work.
So perfect. Of course, he's the man who should know all about cards. I mean, wasn't he the senator from Delaware?
Biden.
Oh, yeah.
Blinken.
Oh, Blinken. That's right.
Blinken.
I always get the two mixed up for some reason.
Yeah. Thank you, Sparky, for that. From Stan, Jacob Schiff funded Japan against Russia in 1904. New York still worships money and Fukuyama, NATO based on fake money. Multilateralism will be much better than globalism.
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is an important point to make, actually. It touches on a point that you've just made, which is that, of course, we are absolutely not opposed to cooperation between states, to states being friends, doing things with each other, and being friendly with each other. That has nothing to do with this other project, which is globalization, which is basically to do away with states completely. And by doing away with states, do away with democracy, because it's through states that democracy expresses itself.
Yeah. Fred Smith, thank you for that super sticker. From Alexander, don't forget that a recent poll by a major Ukrainian pollster showed that 41% of the population considers Russians and Ukrainians one nation.
Absolutely.
And likely an underestimate for fear of reprisals, in my opinion.
Overwhelmingly likely. And I agree. And of course, that opinion poll has never been reported, to my knowledge. That aspect of the poll has never been reported in the media in the West either. And it was striking that after all this relentless propaganda that Ukrainians must have been subjected to since 2014, that 41% of Ukrainians in an opinion poll were prepared to say that.
Yeah. From Flying Boar, update on Syria and Nord Stream 2.
Syria and Nord Stream 2, two very different topics.
And then update on Kazakhstan as well, from Flying Boar.
Kazakhstan, Syria. Right. Let's start with Kazakhstan. We had Nazarbayev, the former president. He wheeled out, pledged allegiance to Tokayev, denied that there'd been a power struggle. In fact, this rather sad address to the nation clearly was Nazarbayev signing off and basically being shuffled off the scene. And what we now learn is that he's resigned all his posts, including his position in the ruling party, which, by the way, I should say, is essentially the old Kazakh Communist Party, reorganized to run the country under Nazarbayev, who was its first secretary. But anyway, Tokayev has taken over all the levers and institutions of power. He's now appointing his own people. He's sacking more and more of Nazarbayev's. It's basically a complete takeover of the government. It's clear that Tokayev has consolidated his control. And it's also clear that this coup attempt has failed. And I understand that there's still some tension in the country, and there's still a lot of military and security people about. But overall, we can definitely say, I think, that the crisis in Kazakhstan has ended, at least for the moment. And it's also clear that Kazakhstan is now firmly anchored in the Russian alliance system and in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Tokayev has won, Putin has won, China has won, Nazarbayev is out, the West has lost, Erdogan, I suspect, has lost. So that's Kazakhstan. Syria, I think we can definitely see now a steady course towards stabilization. There's talk that Syria could be readmitted into the Arab League as soon as in March. Arab embassies are opening in Damascus. More and more of the country, Idlib province, apparently is increasingly slipping under Syrian government control. Heavy Russian bombing raids, by the way, on jihadi positions in northern Idlib. Turkey is apparently, there's rumors that even Erdogan is now looking for a way out. So I think the situation in Syria is now very close to stabilization. And with Assad firmly in control. And what was the third one? Nord Stream 2.
We've talked about that, yeah. But
Nord Stream 2. We've had this. Now, I'm going to say something about Nord Stream 2 because, of course, we had this absolute crackpot situation where the US says it opposes Nord Stream 2. And the administration says it opposes Nord Stream 2. And then it torpedoes sanctions against Nord Stream 2 in the Senate using the filibuster, which it also opposes. I mean, absolutely crazy stuff. Well, the reason that has happened is because with the option of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT having apparently been dropped, and with the Europeans apparently refusing to stop Russian banks from using the euro, there is no real sanctions left, if you think about it, for the Europeans to impose in the event that we went all out on a sanctions offensive. So what are the sanctions that the Europeans are going to impose? Well, they're going to stop Nord Stream 2. That's apparently the entirety of the European sanctions package. This pipeline, Germany and Europe needs, but which Russia doesn't. And by the way, if you hear a lot about the cost to Russia of building the pipeline, my friend Tom Longo pointed out to me that Russia recoups the entire construction cost of Nord Stream 2 from 1 month's gas sales. So it's a pinprick. So it's Germany that's going to lose out by not activating Nord Stream 2. But that apparently is the sum total, in effect, of the sanctions that the European Union is going to impose if we really end up in a sanctions war. So that's why the administration had to agree not to impose sanctions on it at this stage, because if it imposed those sanctions, there wouldn't have been anything left for the Europeans to do. It shows you how empty their locker of ammunition really is. However, the reality is the Germans need Nord Stream 2. And what's going to happen, I think, is that they're going to pray and hope that there isn't a war in Ukraine this winter. And they're going to be telling Zelensky, please don't start a war in Ukraine this winter. And they haven't actually exactly barred US and British aircraft flying weapons to Ukraine crossing over German territory, but it's clear that they're unwelcome because the British and American planes have to skirt around Germany, and the Germans have refused also to supply arms to Ukraine. So the Germans now, it seems to me, because they need Nord Stream 2, they don't want to impose these sanctions, and they're pressuring quietly behind the scenes the Ukrainians not to start any trouble in Ukraine. So that's the story of Nord Stream 2. I expect Nord Stream 2, on the assumption that there isn't going to be a war in Ukraine this winter, I now expect Nord Stream 2 to be certified and to start operation in the summer.
Yeah. From Chris, Thatcher is largely admired here in the US for her role in conclusion of the Cold War, but most Brits seem to hate her, often calling her authoritarian. What is the truth?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to this. I mean, one has to understand that, of course, Thatcher was a giant figure, but she was also somebody who never balked from battles. And of course, that meant a lot of people in Britain came to dislike her intensely. And she still provokes very strong feelings amongst many, many people. She's always been a more divisive figure within Britain than she was outside it. But having said that, I think even many of her opponents respect her force of personality and her strength of personality, and acknowledge the enormous changes that she made to Britain. And you get this sense very much, and it's a moment which I've never forgotten, when she eventually had to resign after this successful coup that was launched against her within the Conservative Party. And she went to the House of Commons, and it was very striking that the people who spoke most warmly about her in many cases were Labour MPs. especially old left-wing Labour MPs of the kind which barely exists nowadays. And I remember one of them, Dennis Skinner, who represented a coal mining constituency, actually joked that she'd be the right person to make governor of the European Central Bank. This is before it had even been set up, by the way. And I remember Thatcher laughing and things of that kind. So she is still, I mean, there's still very strong feelings about her in Britain. Many people very antagonistic to her. Many people very opposed to her. Many people feel she took Britain in the wrong direction. All of this, however, combined with a real respect for her and a recognition, even by many of the people who opposed her, that she was a titanic figure who changed Britain.
From Heyman, both China and Russia would have preferred strong ties with the U.S. than with each other. We will unite all those we seek to contain and at a huge cost.
That's completely true. That's absolutely right. You go back to the early 2000s when, you know, Russia and China first started to have, well, you know, the time just after Putin became leader. At that time, China was overwhelmingly focused on good relations with the US. I mean, Russia hardly figured, and the Russians were intent still. I mean, Putin was still talking about our common European home and was looking to join the EU, for example. So you're absolutely right. At that time, they'd improved their relations. China and Russia had improved relations, but they were not prioritizing their relations with each other. And I remember that in the Russian case, I remember that there was a huge amount of anger when the Russians sold China Sukhoi 27 fighter jets, only for the Chinese to produce their own copy. And I remember how angry the Russians were about this, and how for a time they blocked all further arms sales to China because of that. And you know, that was the reality then, and it's been completely thrown away. That massive opportunity to build a relationship with Russia, especially with China, I think some kind of adversarial relationship would eventually have developed anyway. But certainly with Russia, it was thrown away. And as Alex said earlier in the program, historians will look back and they will shake their heads and they'll say how frivolously it was done.
Yeah. From AD, super chat. Thank you very much, AD. And Fred Smith, thank you for that super chat as well. And ALQK says, thoughts on the complications in relations between Zelensky and the U.S. Do opposition parties in the Ukraine offer the West other opportunities?
No, in a word, you mustn't talk about opposition parties in Ukraine. What you must talk about are oligarchical factions. Even the party that's often referred to as the pro-Russia party, Medvedchuk's party, is essentially an oligarchical faction. Parties, political parties, when they try to emerge in Ukraine, are basically stamped on very quickly. So yes, the United States does have alternatives to Zelensky, but always be very clear about it. It would be done through court intrigues and those kind of operations. We're not talking about supporting active political forces in the sense that parties are.
Yeah. It's the oligarchs that run the show. From Marit, Soviet Union was a technological marvel. Russia Federation is its heir. During the 90s, production of machine tools slowed, but the technology didn't go away. It has been rejuvenated since Mr. Putin came.
It has taken a huge amount of time, and we mustn't underestimate two things. Firstly, yes, in its heyday, the Soviet Union was very advanced in many technologies. But I think it's widely accepted that because of all kinds of problems that were mounting in the economy, a lot of things by the 1980s were beginning to become run down, and that Soviet scientific and technological base was not as efficient or as productive by then as it had been. And secondly, the damage that was done in the 1990s was so enormous that rebuilding that technology base has been a Herculean labor. But it's now happening. And to give an example, As I understand it, all of these Russian weapon systems that we're talking about, and I'm not just talking about, Poseidon drones and things like that, but, nuclear submarines, Russian drones, for example, they use only Russian components. There's been a decision that, we're not going to import chips, say, from Taiwan or wherever, and put them in our drones. We're actually going to design our own chips. And that, of course, has slowed all of these programs. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the famous Armata tank took much longer to bring into service than people had at one time thought it would, because they decided every single component in it had to be designed and made in Russia. But they did it. They got there in the end. And we're going to see more and more of that. And it's taken a very long time to do. But I agree, the technology base has been reassembled. I don't think it's yet fully at the level that it might be, but it's still a work in progress. But that work is, to a very great extent, largely done.
Yep. From Anatoly, what are the major energy sources in Europe that are reliable and efficient? The liquefied gas from the US seems to be to their disadvantage.
Well, indeed, that is an excellent question. I was reading an article recently about the nuclear power industry in France. I think France gets about 80% of its nuclear power, its electricity from nuclear power. And I've been wondering a lot about the kind of conditions that it's in and what the French are doing about that. And it turns out that the nuclear power complex in France is in poor shape. That something like a fifth of the reactors have been taken off stream for essential maintenance. That even many of those reactors that are working, there's been underinvestment in them because of the structural problems in the French economy. And so there isn't actually an opportunity to boost nuclear power generation in France. And of course, there was natural gas in Europe, in places like Norway, the North Sea, but that's starting to run down. Coal isn't being mined in any great quantities anymore, except in a few places, in Poland, for example, but it's nowhere near a substitute. The Europeans have gambled everything on alternatives, on wind and solar. Of course, you can't have much solar in Northern Europe. There isn't much sun. So wind power especially. And of course, what's happened, and I think it's been a profound shock, is there's been now this understanding about how unreliable it is and how you can't really hope to build a complete energy complex on it. So at the moment, the Europeans are in a very difficult position. They've been able to avoid making difficult decisions about their energy situation because they've been importing all this gas from Russia and from other places. And now they realize how vulnerable their entire energy system has become.
From Anatoly, Republicans are just as, if not more, into war than the Democrats. More of them in power will not guarantee peaceful times. P.S. Biden is part of the establishment. He'll be retired, not impeached.
Anatoly, you're right. Except, of course, I will say this. I agree with you fundamentally that you will find some incredibly belligerent and confrontational Republicans. But you will also find that the only coherent opposition to this kind of warfare comes from Republicans. It's one of the fundamental fault lines within the Republican Party. So if you go to a place like, say, the Federalist, which is, very much a Trumpian type of website, one reason why it comes in for massive amounts of criticism, even though actually when you read it, it's a pretty good website, at least in my opinion. Obviously it has its politics, its perspective, but they are basically against interventionism. They're against wars. They're against those sort of things. And they are, of course, Republicans. And you go to National Review, which is a sort of Mitch McConnell wing type of journal, much more establishment. Of course, they're all into neocon wars, confrontations with Russia, all that sort of thing. So there is a battle within the Republican Party over which direction to take. There isn't an equivalent battle any longer in the Democratic Party. Once upon a time, anti-war voices in the United States were on the left, and they were most articulated in the Democratic Party. That's no longer the case to any great extent anymore. Tulsi Gabbard was just the last person left who articulated that kind of traditional anti-war position in the Democratic Party. And she's been frozen out. She's not even in the House of Representatives anymore.
She's gone.
She's gone.
Raphael says, Russia and China understand one thing well. Their existence depends solely on both standing together as one. Do not finish like Germany. Strength.
Absolutely correct. That's absolutely right. Each understands that they each have to have the other at their back. They understand that very well.
Yep. Cosmic Rain says, I have a bit of migraine. So I'll have to leave a bit early, but please keep up the good work, lads, as always. Thank you very much.
And look after your migraine. And by the way, I get them. I get them as well.
And take care and get rest.
I know what they're like. Yeah,
absolutely. From Indigo Jones, rumors are heating prices for a modest 2-bedroom unit could go to 1,500 euros a month or higher. Absolutely. Is this possible, and is Russia bashing a diversion?
It is entirely possible, and Russia bashing might be a diversion. It might be a way of blaming the Russians for the whole thing. But of course, if you want to deal with the problem of your heating prices, the heating crisis, well, the first thing you do is you end this period of international tension, and you switch on Nord Stream 2. Exactly. I mean, it's so simple.
My God. All right. Thank you, Michael, for that super sticker. And thank you, Kuplex, for that super sticker as well. And Elena says, do you think Poland realizes they will be the cannon fodder if there's a conflict in Ukraine and Russia? And how do they feel about it?
Many Poles realize it, and many Poles don't like it. Unfortunately, the Polish political class, not everybody in it, but most of them, are still very caught up in this anti-Russian policies that have their origins to, they have a long historical legacy. And by the way, I have an understanding of it. I mean, I've never understood Britain's animus towards Russia. I've never understood why the British have this complex about Russia. Poland, I can understand. I mean, Polish-Russian interactions have often been very brutal. And many Poles, I can understand why they have hard feelings about Russia. But I think a lot of Poles understand that, this is not working out well for them. And they're speaking out against it. Even Lech Wałęsa, the former Solidarność leader, has spoken out against it, for example. So...
I think during your live on Local, someone mentioned that, is it Duda that's going to the Beijing Olympics? So you can tell they have an understanding of the geopolitical dimensions.
Yeah. Absolutely correct. That's entirely right.
It's Duda, right?
It's Duda.
Yeah, okay, he's going to the Beijing. Yeah, that's big. If he's going to go
big. It's very big news. Can I say something else? I think that Poland needs to put aside all of this anti-Russian animus. It needs to do what de Gaulle did with Germany in the 50s and 60s, make up. And de Gaulle forged this friendship with the German Chancellor, Adenauer, and it transformed the situation in Western Europe. When a Polish de Gaulle appears, a Polish leader appears, who's prepared to do that with the Russians, and he'd find the Russians fully receptive to that, by the way, that will transform the situation in Eastern Europe as well. Poland doesn't understand its own power. That's my own personal view. And it's using the power it has wrongly. It's working itself up with the Russian bear as if the Russia of today is the Russia of Catherine the Great and of Stalin. I mean, it isn't. I mean, that's not what the Russians are about. The Russians have no hostility to Poland at all. and the Russians would be look very, very favorably upon a reconciliation with Poland. And the worst possible policy that Poland could follow would be to get dragged into these anti-Russian schemes that the neocons in Washington and the European Commission people have in Brussels. Poland would only stand to lose from all of that.
Yeah, there's some very powerful neocons, though, in and around Poland.
Absolutely, of course they are. Yeah. Well, I mean, bear in mind that Radek
Sikorski, Applebaum.
Absolutely, exactly, and his wife is, of course, Anne Applebaum. So there's all those sorts of people around.
Yeah, those are some big neocon names.
My own view, by the way, is that Polish-Russian reconciliation is going to come, and it's going to come a lot sooner than many people realize. One of the fundamental differences now is that Russians and Poles can travel and get to know each other in ways that was simply not the case previously. I mean, that's not going to change. And at a personal level, they actually get on. I've seen this time and again in London. I meet Poles, I meet Russians. Sometimes, as happened, for example, on the occasion of my own wedding, I had a Polish friend and a Russian friend, and you saw them maneuvering and working things out, and then eventually toasting each other over vodka. And you see this happen time and again. And I'm sure it will happen at a political level too.
All right, Charlie, CCC says, Saudi bombed internet provider in Yemen. Haven't had contact with anyone there for almost 24 hours. What's the purpose of this besides chaos? Pray for Yemen.
It has no other purpose any longer than chaos. I mean, the Saudis need to disengage from Yemen. But of course, MBS's face is so tied up with it. He started this stupid war, and he finds it very difficult, I think, to extricate himself from it. Also, there's the other thing. He's trying to patch up things with the Iranians, and he doesn't want to pull back from Yemen because, of course, I suspect he worries that if he just did that, he would weaken his hand in his negotiations with the Iranians. Well, I think that's a stupid policy, and I think it's an immoral one, and I think he needs to stop. And these kind of things that he's just done, these bombing raids are just terrible, and they're very bad for Saudi Arabia too, and of course terrible for Yemen.
Anatoly says, will Trump run in 2024? And if not, who for the red? For the Republicans?
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether he will run
leaning
or not.
Towards it.
I think he's leaning towards
it. Yeah, he's leaning towards it.
Yeah,
we'll see after the midterms. I think a lot will clear up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if not for the Reds, well, I mean,
DeSantis looks to me. I mean, I saw a poll, a recent opinion poll, which had Trump. I mean, he was 67% of Republicans would support him if he stood again. But if he didn't stand again, the person who came top was DeSantis.
Yeah. Ryan says, it's funny Trump goes on Hannity and adamantly denies the feud with DeSantis, but Kamala and Joe Biden dance around their feuds without addressing it.
Well, it's not funny. It's unsurprising because he doesn't have a feud with DeSantis. So
Kamala Biden.
But whereas Kamala Biden, well, it's a different thing, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Kamala's busy making these kind of Zen, putting together these Zen phrases.
No,
boy, Toilet Sauce says, speaking of able-bodied Ukrainian citizens, after the massive Black Sea shipyard in Nikolaev went bankrupt and fired its workers, most of those went to find jobs in Russia.
Yeah.
And there's a second part. They were hired largely by Zalil shipyard in Crimea.
Indeed.
They are now building Russia's helicopter carriers and Sevmash in northern Russia, where they are building nuclear-powered submarines. Both shipyards are expanding.
Absolutely, and I mean that's another big story, which is we're talking about changes. I mean, and how the Russian industrial system has responded well to sanctions, but the Russians have been rebuilding their shipyards, and this is another big story because the shipyards had during the 1990s completely fallen apart, and they'd already become very run down in the late Soviet period. But Zalev in Crimea is has been correctly said, is now building these helicopter carriers. Sevmash, it is beyond the Arctic Circle. No, wait a minute. Sevmash, yeah, it is. It's beyond the beyond the Arctic Circle is where they build nuclear submarines and nuclear warships. Then there's the big shipyards in St. Petersburg, but the really giant shipyards that are now being built are in the Far East, and there's a huge one which is under construction, which will be and which is going to be extremely modern, and there's a possibility that aircraft carriers could be built there, but I'm not convinced that's going to happen actually.
From Matt, why is Alexander in a book factory?
Well,
a lot of books.
I read a lot of books, or at least I used to. It's time for that now.
All right. Cactus Ray, thank you for that super sticker. And Raphael says a British battleship is the first thing Russia will take out in the Black Sea. Canada is the first place China will hit. For Xi and Trudeau, it's personal.
I have to say, the British decision to send these frigates steaming close to Sevastopol, I mean, was incredibly reckless. Again, it shows a fundamental failure to remember history. British seem to have lost their capacity for understanding history, by the way. But I mean, going back to Ben Wallace's article, for example, he was talking about the friendly relations Britain and Russia had in the 19th century, the 18th century. But of course, Britain invaded Russia. There was the Crimean War, and that was a siege of Sevastopol. And you send a warship, a British warship, close to Sevastopol. Russians haven't forgotten the Crimean War. It's much more a vivid memory. And of course, in Sevastopol, it's a very vivid memory. And when the ship was allowed to steam away, there were criticisms of Putin in Russia for letting it steam away and for not taking stronger action, and indeed for sinking it. So I think people in Britain need to understand that Russia has a public opinion, and it's quite different from what Westerners often imagine.
Yeah. Renat says, here's something interesting. Chinese factories are producing stuff. Trump 2020 for your info. Thank you very much, Renat.
I didn't know that.
Super chat. That is super interesting.
Yeah.
So they're gearing up for a Trump 2024, it seems.
Well, indeed.
Gregory Casey says up to 5,000 ISIS prisoners escaped from a Kurd SDF prison in Hasakah last night and are now floating free along the Iraq-Syria border, ready to implement U.S. policy against both countries.
Which begs the question of whether they escaped or whether someone left the door open. I mean, that's not impossible. Exactly. But you know, I'm not going to speculate more about that. Without more detailed knowledge. But it's important to say that obviously we're talking about a stabilization of the situation in Syria, stabilization to some extent of the situation in Iraq, but the opportunities for meddling and problem creating are endless in that region. And of course there are people like that who are jihadi fighters who are very, very dangerous, and they're still there.
Thank you, Lurias, for that super sticker. And Gregory Casey says Thatcher was and continues to be hated in Ireland.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Very true.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for that. Rich says, is Italy doing diplomacy with Russia regarding the Western media crisis in Ukraine? Can Russia-Italian relations play a role in resolving the crisis?
They could, in theory. It's one of the great disappointments about Italy, which is that it never punches up to its weight. I mean, you remember I mentioned earlier in the program how I was at those two conferences in St. Petersburg, and that was where I saw Putin for the only time I've ever seen him in the flesh. Well, at one of those meetings, there was an Italian prime minister there, Matteo Renzi. And he was talking about the situation in Ukraine, and he showed full awareness over the course of that meeting that the Ukrainians were not implementing the Minsk agreement. And he made it very clear that he wanted to see the Ukrainians implement the Minsk agreement. Well, that's what he said in Russia. And then he went away and did nothing. And it did strike me at the time that, again, a active Italian foreign policy could have made a real difference. Italy is one of the big countries in the European Union. It's got lots of goodwill. Russians have very, very friendly feelings towards Italy. If they wanted to play up to their strengths, they could do it. They never do. And the reason for that is you have only to look at the nature, the awful nature of the Italian political system. Now, this talk that this period of false, fake stability that we got with Draghi's premiership is coming to an end. We'll see what openings that creates if Draghi does indeed leave the scene, and whether that might change.
Yeah. Zariel says, Alexander, British only? The whole world has forgotten history. To quote George Santayana, those who forget history will repeat its mistakes.
Well, that's absolutely true. Only, of course, not the whole world. Lots of the world knows history very well. You listen, I mean, you read Xi Jinping's speeches or his interactions, whatever else he is, and he's someone I have difficulty getting a complete picture of, because he is somebody who I think deliberately avoids putting too much of himself forward. But certainly he's somebody who knows his history. He knows his Chinese history extremely well. Putin the same. And my interactions with Russians and Chinese shows that these are very historically minded countries and societies. I'm afraid in the West, I would agree with that. I think that they either don't know their history, are not interested in it, or they know a false history, which is often sold to them.
Toilet Sauce says, did anyone notice that the Ukrainian army was moving around the infamous Buk 312 and was filmed doing so?
Yes, and many people have commented on it, but not in the mainstream media. And you have to be very, very careful what you say about this topic. I can tell you, because I've written articles about this which have vanished.
Yeah. We Karens, thank you for your super sticker. Martin Spellman says, how does Europe develop its own energy?
How does Europe develop its own energy? It's a very good question.
Well, Nord Stream 2.
Well, start off.
Start Nord Stream 2.
That's the first thing you must do. Seek peace in Europe, real peace in Europe. Yeah. End NATO expansion, end EU expansion. Do that deal. You don't sacrifice any real interests. On the contrary, you safeguard them. Yeah. This is a win-win for Europe if they did that. But of course, the people in Brussels are ideologues, and you only have to listen to Josep Borrell and Ursula and all those awful people, and you can see that.
Well, they need to justify their jobs and their paychecks. So
exactly.
Yeah, they won't jeopardize that. Thank you, Black Tie, for that 25-pound super chat. And Jonathan, Boris's foreign policy decisions are more out of opportunism, whereas his opponents are true believers in the Atlanticist anti-Russian line.
I think that's exactly right. I think that is a true comment. I think it nails it exactly.
Yeah, spot on. C. Mavuso, thank you for your super chat. Life of Brian says, are Boris's blackmailers mad that their actions essentially liberated Britain?
You cannot imagine how incandescent they are. I mean, you have to read. You have to know how to read the British newspapers, which, by the way, at times make Pravda look easy to decipher. But if you read between the lines, I mean, they are livid. They are incredibly angry. And because they're so angry, it's important to say that Boris himself is not out of the woods. I mean, they're already looking for ways to come back at him next week. So this isn't over politically.
Yeah. Interesting how that all worked out, isn't it? Hey Man says, thoughts on Xi's speech at the WEF, the World Economic Forum?
It's a classic example of what I said. He says one thing in one audience and seems to do something quite opposite. One of the points I would say about the Chinese is that they've, I think, figured out the WEF very well and figured it out a long, long time ago. And what they were doing very, very skillfully is that they talk the talk. They know how to talk the talk. And then they twist it all to their own advantage. Now, I'm by the way, making no moral comment there. Each country, every government should work to its own strengths and should play to its own strengths. But if there's been one big winner from globalization, it has been China. And they've played the WEF, the Davos people, all of them. They've played them like a violin. It's been amazing to see, and all credit to them.
What is it that you say? China is globalist to the world, but not sovereigntist, nationalist.
Absolutely. Inside out. Exactly.
Yeah. Let's see here from Stan regarding the BBC. I'm old enough to remember when the BBC was the gold standard for international news on shortwave, and now it is as bad or worse than CNN, and I refuse to listen or watch.
Absolutely.
Now there is no Western source to rely on except the Duran. Support this channel or else you will be misinformed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I not only do I agree with you, for much of my life, I used to start the day by listening to the BBC World Service, listening to the BBC World Service international news programs. I mean, the 80s through this, the 80s, the 90s, much of the 2000s. That was how I used to start my day. I used to prefer going to the BBC World Service. I used to do that first, and then I used to go to the newspapers. Well, I haven't listened to the BBC World Service now for so long, I can't even remember, because, again, I mean, it sounds more like Radio Moscow used to do than the BBC World Service that I remember.
Yeah. Veveridu says, regarding Germany, there have been strong politicians such as Friedrich Merz from the CDU, but they were all beheaded by Merkel.
Absolutely.
He was with BlackRock in the meantime. He has now come back and a member of the CDU, the opposition party.
He is, in fact, as I understand it, the de facto leader, and he's made some very, very pointed comments about the utter folly for Germany of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT. So he's around, and can I just say, he was the obvious person to succeed Merkel. And Merkel didn't want him and managed to sideline him. And that has been a tragedy for Germany.
Yeah. Dead Beaten Don says, I recently came across interesting statistics. In 2019, the top product exported by the U.S. to China was 8.5 billion worth of integrated circuits. The top export by China to the U.S. was 50 billion worth of broadcast equipment.
Well, there you go.
All that narrative construction is expensive. Well said. Well said there. And let's see. Davwil says, Nuland has an 18-point response, but is having difficulty with Russian spell check.
The Russians have ridiculed that comment of hers. I mean, Peskov, Lavrov, they've all mocked it. I mean, 18? I mean, it's... Why not crazy. 17 or 19 or 30 or whatever? I mean,
Boy, does she hate Russia. Vedveridu says, the Austrian government decided yesterday that there will be compulsory jabs. Yeah. Now they have incurred the double wrath of the unjabbed and the jabbed.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This is all last spasms before this whole thing collapses.
Exactly. Aqua 410.3 says, is Ukraine really important for Russia? If yes, is it for the farmlands and military industry or for their religious reasons, the Orthodox Church?
Well, we should never discount the religious thing. I mean, can I just say that one of the things that really upset Russians, even Russians who are not religious, was the split in, the attempt to engineer this split in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the backing by the patriarch of this schismatic church in Ukraine. And that really annoyed many Russians, and it really did cut through in a very powerful way. So one must not discount that. And Russians do have very strong feelings about Ukraine. I mean, as Alex said, there is a massive amount of intermarriage. People in Ukraine and Russia are related to each other in many cases. These are not foreign countries to each other in the way that people in the West like to sort of claim they are. So Russians do care about Ukraine. I think the agriculture, the industry, all of that is old stuff. I don't think they're particularly fussed about that, frankly. I think they've developed their own industries now, their own agriculture. They don't need Ukraine for any of that. But they do want security on their western borders.
Yeah.
And they do not want to see NATO advance into Ukraine and start aiming missiles at Moscow from Ukrainian territory. So that, I think, is the overriding concern.
Alan says, can the Duran please do a program about the development of modern China, the last empire, Sun Yat-sen, etc.?
Indeed. And by the way, since we're talking about Sun Yat-sen, this is a Sun Yat-sen watch, which I bought when I was in China in 2016 at his former house. Cool. So there you go. Or rather, not his former house, his wife's former house. And my mother had, my wife, not my mother. My wife has the, so this is the male version. Catherine has the female version of it. But anyway, putting all that aside, we certainly should do a program about modern China. And it is enormously interesting. I would say, as I said, that I don't have the Chinese sources to hand as I do with the Russian, simply because I haven't seen that many books authored by Chinese about these topics. So, for example, I know that the Chinese have a particular perspective on the Korean War, which I'm not really very familiar with. So there are those things to say. But I'd love to do a program about China. China is an enormously interesting country, and its modern history is extraordinary.
Yep. Gordon, thank you for that super sticker. Really appreciate it. And Spyrus says, what is the purpose of America's alliance with Israel? How does it benefit the U.S.? And Otto M says it benefits U.S. defense contractors.
Well, indeed it does. That is a very, very big part of it. Though one must not overlook I'll call them the sentimental attachments, which are very, very real. And I mean, some of these are founded on religion and Christianity and memories of Israel in the old kingdoms of Israel. And I think that plays some part, certainly played part in Britain. I can remember in my childhood, for example, when I was at school, we used to read all the stories about the kings of Israel and the life of Israel and Judah, the two kingdoms. And of course, that did make one think that the current state of Israel was in some way a continuation of that. So there is that. But I also think that there is an affinity with Israel, because it is a country that is Western in some ways, in a part of the world which isn't, and there's a kind of identification with it. And of course, there's many, many people in the United States, not just people of Jewish origin, but many, many people beyond that, who feel that attachment to Israel. And I think that's going to go on for a very long time. I don't see that ending anytime soon, by the way.
From Leafy Bug, Boris's plan B, flip-flop, indicates what a lowly character he is. If he believes, as many politicians do, that these measures were protecting people and saving lives, then removing them to protect his position is unconscionable. But I suspect he's known their political theater for some time, yet maintained them until he needed to save his miserable skin. The human cost of these restrictions is beyond calculation. Boris used them to get out of jail free card. Wow, and unforgivable. That's an interesting take on it.
He's absolutely right.
Yeah,
he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The thing to understand about Boris, the reason why I ultimately, I can see what Boris is doing, and sometimes I can see that he's doing good, if you like. But I mean, or rather, I can support him on individual policies. But I will always have deeply ambivalent feelings about him, and that's an understatement, actually, because fundamentally and ultimately, he is in it for himself. He is extremely imaginative. He's an extremely talented politician, but he's utterly unscrupulous. He's that very weird combination. He's not a person of any deep principle at all. And that's an aspect of Boris's personality that many people in Britain find very difficult to stomach and understand. But I come back to this. He does have a feel for the pulse of the nation, which other politicians, more orthodox, more conventional politicians in British politics don't. And he's always able to jump ahead of the curve in a way that they never seem to do. He did that with Brexit, and he's done it again with this reversal of policies that he's just done. And the result is that just as he surfed the Brexit tide all the way to Downing Street, so he's going to surf this particular tide, or at least I think he will surf this particular tide, and that will keep him in Downing Street.
Yep. JT says, following on your point of Russia building their own components for developing weapon systems, once you have the components, then you make common frameworks on top of it for different weapon systems. Then you build customized solutions for those specific weapons.
Absolutely. And you also start to do other things, which is, of course, you now have an industrial and technology base that you can start adapting to do other things, to start producing consumer electronics, for example. And those kind of things. And, I'm hearing stories that that's starting to happen in various fields. And that, for example, because of all this talk about iPhones and all that sort of thing, that we're starting to see for the first time serious efforts in Russia to, smartphones are now being made in Russia in ways that Russian designed and made our smartphones are starting to appear in Russia in a way that had never really been the case before. I mean, the Russians had made various attempts to start things, but they'd never really worked out. But now, because there's an industrial base behind it, they can perhaps start to do it. And in fact, I'm sure they will.
Elena Diaz says, Alexander, Radio Moscow was a source of hope for us in Chile after the Pinochet coup. It meant somebody was listening and trying to help. Just telling that the Russians' solidarity during that time is not forgotten.
No, I understand that completely. And in fact, can I just say something? When I said that the BBC Today World Service sounds like Radio Moscow, I was actually being I was unfair to Radio Moscow because, Radio Moscow was what it was. It really was. And by the way, it's world. I guess it's going back to a media world that was a long time ago. The Radio Moscow's World Service was, I thought it was awful, frankly. But some of its individual services, its Latin American service, it's even the one that it broadcast to Britain, were actually quite interesting. A lot better than what you see the BBC Today produce. At least it was more intelligent and it was better informed.
Toilet Sauce says Rio Tinto has been kicked out of Serbia.
Oh, really? Interesting. Wow.
That is interesting news. Yeah. They may have been behind Djokovic. And Sean Ellis says, if Trump were still in office after beating Russiagate and pandemic ending soon, what do you think American policies would be now?
Well, who knows? Different from
better.
Very different. Very different.
Better.
Alex, go ahead.
Better.
Yeah.
Better.
So, yeah. Well, at least there'd be a president. At least there'd be a government.
Exactly. Yeah. You said it right there. At least there would be someone. Yeah, absolutely. And Chris says Thatcher wouldn't have tolerated woke ideology in the UK.
Oh, absolutely not. She wouldn't have tolerated this collapse in relations with Russia either, by the way.
Yeah. And Leafybug says a good way for China to forcibly indicate to the U.S. that it can sink U.S. carriers is by sinking a UK carrier, sending the Queen Elizabeth II on its maiden voyage into the South China Sea was incredibly reckless.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I don't think the Chinese would do it for the moment, but you never know. And it is reckless. And you never put your people in harm's way without good reason, without good cause. So sending frigates to Sevastopol and aircraft carriers into the South China Sea to sort of provoke the Russians and the Chinese is beyond reckless and stupid and extraordinarily callous of your own people.
Yep. And the final comment comes from Tony, who says, I'm no fan of the unscrupulous Boris Johnson, but when it comes to the COOF issue, I think Boris is following popular opinion, which is what leaders of a democracy are supposed to do.
Absolutely. Well, exactly right. I mean, I'm going to go even further. I don't actually like Boris Johnson. I mean, I never have done. I've always found him it's always a difficult man to like. He's lazy. He's self-indulgent. He's very tolerant of corruption in others. He's not beyond doing things, that materially benefit himself. He's certainly not trustworthy. He's ruthless. He's cynical. But
how do you really feel?
But at the end of the day, I try to be objective.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he is the one political leader in the mainstream who both is creative and has that understanding of the pulse of British life.
And he takes risks.
And he takes risks, exactly. Yeah. So he's not the leader that, if you wanted me to come up with the political leader, an alternative leader, the ideal leader, I could do so. We don't have that kind of person in Britain. So, if it's a choice between Boris and Sunak, or Boris and Liz Truss, or Boris and Starmer, well, for me, ultimately, it's not a choice. It has to be Boris. That's not a good thing for a British person to have to say, but it's the reality. And so many people I know think exactly like this.
Yeah, well said. You summed it up well. 2 more super chats came in. From Rich says, Uralmash, another heavy engineering company from the Soviet era, is the world leader in mining machinery.
Absolutely.
It shows hidden range of systems that Russia makes.
And Atomash is one of the major producers in nuclear technology, for example. There was Russian companies and industrial factories have these very strange names sometimes. But MASH refers to machines, by the way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Hunger says, what good books do you recommend on Byzantine and Ottoman Greece? And another person asks about books, Bismarck. I think, if you want to name some books off, that's great, but I think you really should put a list together.
I really will, exactly. I mean, can I just say with Bismarck, there is so much to read about Bismarck, but can I strongly recommend one particular book, which is Bismarck's own memoirs. I mean, he is a brilliant writer, and you get a very, very strong sense of his personality by first of all reading his own memoirs. They're quite brilliant, and there've been lots of good books written about him by all sorts of people. Taylor, AJP Taylor, for example, used to write brilliantly about Bismarck in former times, but start with Bismarck's book, his memoirs himself. Now, on Greece, well, if you're talking about Byzantium, there is a vast number of books you could read. You could start with Runciman, who wrote a long time ago, but actually liked the Byzantines and liked the Byzantine Empire. And he can be quite interesting about this. And but there's lots and lots of others. I think I would have to do a list, actually, if we're talking about the Byzantine Empire. Ottoman Greece, I'm frankly far less informed about. It's, for Greeks, for me included, it's painful history. So it's not something I particularly find easy to read about. So I'm sure there are lots of fine books about it, but I'm not really in a position to recommend anything there, because it's a topic that I've avoided up to now.
Yeah. Well, Alexander, it's been quite alive.
Well, it has.
3.5 hours.
Wow. Hasn't felt like it, if I may say. It's been stimulating.
Yeah,
it's been an amazing
ton of ground.
Ton of ground, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness,
any final thoughts, Alexander, as we sign off for the weekend?
Yeah, I'm going to straightforwardly say this: we're starting the final days of NATO. I know that sounds a strange thing to say, but it's hit the buffers. It's not going to expand eastward anymore, and it'll start to reverse on itself, and then it will collapse, and eventually, someone in the United States, perhaps Donald Trump, but someone like him, is going to come along and realize this thing is a liability. It's not an asset.
They don't need it.
They don't need it.
The U.S. taxpayer doesn't need it.
The U.S. taxpayer doesn't need it. And, Tucker's point, we're spending all this time fretting and fixating about Ukraine, even though it isn't really about Ukraine. But, all these things far away from the United States, it doesn't add to American power. It drains American power.
Drains it.
And some people, of course, do very well from it. But overall, it's a liability. And I think we're now looking at the final days of NATO.
Yeah. You heard it here first.
Absolutely.
All right. That's a great way to end the live stream, Alexander. Thank you to everyone on Locals. Great chat there. Thank you to everyone in this chat on YouTube as well. Great comments and great questions. Thank you to all our super chats. Thank you very, very much to our awesome moderators, Valley S, Cosmic Rain, Zarael, Alan Watson, Reckless Abandon. Did I miss anybody? I don't think I missed anybody that was moderating today. Thank you very much for all the moderation and for keeping the chat moving along. And thank you, Sima Vuso, for your super chat that just came in. Why is the USA thinking they're responsible to solve the problems of this world?
Well, I think many Americans don't think that. There are some people in America who do, because it's the indispensable country after all, or at least so they say. But in reality, the United States cannot solve every problem in the world. It's not its business to do so. The business of the United States is the United States and the American people. And when America knew that, it boomed. It became the world's greatest power. And one day, I'm convinced it will rediscover that truth.
Yep. And tomorrow, Alexander, we have a fantastic history show on the abdication of the Tsar. It's a big one tomorrow as well. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great weekend, and we'll have videos up this weekend. And that's it. Just have a good weekend. All right.
Have a great weekend, and we'll be here next week covering the news as always.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take care.
Oh, everyone fears Russia, but no one has to. That's the last super chat that just came in from Hey Man. Hey Man, we're ending the live stream on your super chat. Everyone fears Russia, but no one has to. Take care.
I might even use that also.
All right. Take care.